Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true small-town horror stories that will make you question what really happens when communities exist in isolation, far from the eyes of the outside world. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who discovered that the most terrifying places in America are not abandoned forests or haunted houses, but the seemingly ordinary towns where everyone knows your name, and secrets are buried deeper than graves. Each story has been thoroughly documented through first-hand testimonials, witness accounts, and verifiable records that confirm these events actually occurred. Small towns across America hold darkness that most people will never encounter, and perhaps that is for the best. If you enjoy authentic horror content that will disturb you long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences in isolated communities or unexplained encounters. Now settle in as we explore the horror that hides behind closed doors and drawn curtains in towns that do not appear on most maps. Samuel had recently moved to Millbrook, a quiet town of barely 800 people nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. What began as an opportunity for a fresh start and escape from the chaos of Louisville quickly turned into an uncomfortable and unrelenting experience that would fundamentally change how he understood human nature. He had chosen the town specifically for its isolation and the remarkably low cost of living, thinking the slower pace would be exactly what he needed after his divorce and the subsequent breakdown that had cost him his teaching position. The local real estate agent, a woman named Martha, who seemed pleasant enough during their phone conversations, had promised him peace, friendly neighbors, and a tight-knit community where everyone looked out for each other. She had made it sound like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, a place where doors remained unlocked and children played freely in the streets until well after dark. But when Samuel pulled into his driveway on that first evening in late September and noticed every single house on his street had their curtains drawn, yet he could feel eyes watching him through the cracks, things took an unexpected turn that he could not have anticipated. The town seemed friendly enough on the surface, with its well-maintained Victorian homes and pristine white church steeple rising above the town square. But before long, it became clear that Millbrook had rules, unspoken ones that outsiders were expected to follow without ever being told what they were or why they mattered. The first week passed in an eerie silence that Samuel initially attributed to small-town reserve and natural suspicion of newcomers. He was a 32-year-old man who understood that trust had to be earned, especially in communities where families had lived for generations and everyone else was considered an outsider until proven otherwise. He made efforts to be friendly, waving to neighbors when he saw them collecting their mail or tending their immaculately kept gardens. But something felt wrong in a way he could not quite articulate. When he waved, people would freeze mid-motion, stare at him with expressions that seemed almost frightened, and then hurry back inside their homes without acknowledging his greeting. At the small grocery store on Main Street, conversations would stop the moment he entered, and other customers would abandon their shopping carts and leave through the back entrance as if his presence contaminated the air itself. The cashier, a teenage girl with dark circles under her eyes, would ring up his items without making eye contact. And when he tried to make small talk about the weather or ask about local restaurants, she would simply shake her head and point to the total on the register screen. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was projecting his own anxieties onto innocent people who were simply shy or unused to strangers. The second week brought the first note. Samuel found it tucked into his screen door when he returned from an unsuccessful job interview at the regional high school in the neighboring county. The paper was aged and yellowed, the handwriting spidery and old-fashioned, written with what appeared to be a fountain pen. It read simply, "Do not walk past the Miller property after sunset. Do not ask why." There was no signature, no explanation, and when Samuel looked up and down his street, he saw no one who might have left it. The Miller property, he had learned from the brief tour Martha had given him, was the large farmhouse at the end of Maple Street, about 4 houses down from his own rental. It looked abandoned, with boarded windows and a yard that had gone wild with weeds and thorny bushes. Though he had noticed that someone must maintain it because the grass was cut and the porch was swept clean, he had thought nothing of it before receiving the note. But now it took on a sinister quality that made him uncomfortable. That evening, testing the warning like a child testing boundaries, he deliberately walked past the Miller property at twilight, his heart pounding with irrational fear. Nothing happened. No one emerged from the house. No supernatural force struck him down. But when he returned to his own home, he found his trash cans overturned and his welcome mat flipped upside down, and he knew with absolute certainty that someone had been watching and had sent him a message. The third week brought more notes, each one containing cryptic warnings that made no logical sense, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Park your car facing east, never west. Do not hang red curtains in your front windows. Avoid the town square on Tuesdays between noon and 1. Never whistle after dark. Samuel tried to laugh them off as the work of bored teenagers or a mentally ill neighbor. But the specificity of the rules and the fact that they kept coming suggested something more organized and deliberate. He began to notice patterns in how his neighbors behaved. Every car on every street faced the same direction. No house had red curtains, though many had red doors or red shutters. The town square, which featured a gazebo and a memorial to Civil War soldiers, was indeed completely deserted every Tuesday at noon, though the shops around it remained open and people simply avoided entering the central area. And he never heard anyone whistle, not once. Not even children playing in their yards during daylight hours. When he tried to break these unspoken rules deliberately, consequences followed swiftly. The day he hung burgundy curtains in his living room, he found a dead crow nailed to his front door. When he parked his car facing west, all 4 tires were slashed overnight. When he whistled while taking out his trash after dinner, his electricity was cut off. And when he called the power company, they insisted there was no outage reported and no explanation for why his home had lost service. By the 4th week, Samuel realized that people were not just avoiding him, but actively crossing the street when they saw him coming. As if he carried some contagious disease or had violated laws so fundamental that his presence offended them on an existential level. Shopkeepers would flip their signs to closed when they saw him approaching, even though he could see other customers inside. The postman began leaving his mail at the end of his driveway rather than bringing it to his door. Children who had been playing would be called inside by their mothers the moment he stepped onto his porch. The ostracism was so complete and so coordinated that Samuel began to doubt his own sanity and perception of reality. He had done nothing wrong that he could identify, committed no social offense beyond being an outsider who had failed to intuit rules that no one would explain. He felt like he was living in a nightmare where everyone had agreed to pretend he did not exist, or worse, that his existence was an active threat to the community. The isolation began to affect him physically. He lost weight because he could not bear to go to the grocery store where he would be treated like a leper. He stopped sleeping well because he could hear footsteps on his porch at night and knew that people were checking on him, watching him, monitoring his compliance with rules he did not fully understand. The breaking point came 5 weeks after his arrival, when Samuel decided he had had enough of the silent treatment and the cryptic warnings. He was an educated man, a former high school history teacher with a master's degree, and he refused to be intimidated by what he had come to think of as small-town cult behavior. He would confront these people and demand answers. He would make them explain their rules and justify their treatment of him. On a Thursday afternoon, he walked to the home of Evelyn Patterson, the only neighbor who had ever spoken to him, though only once, and only to tell him that he should leave Millbrook before Sunday if he valued his peace of mind. She was an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down in a neat yellow cottage with a garden full of chrysanthemums. When she answered his knock, her face went pale, and she tried to close the door. But Samuel put his hand against it and insisted on an explanation. What she told him in a whispered rush of words made him question whether the entire town had lost its collective mind or whether he had stumbled into something far stranger than he had imagined. Evelyn explained that Millbrook had been founded in 1842 by a religious sect that had broken away from mainstream Presbyterian doctrine over issues of predestination and community purity. The original founders had established a complex system of rules and traditions designed to keep the town spiritually clean and protected from outside corruption. These rules had been passed down through generations, evolving and multiplying over nearly 2 centuries. And they governed everything from which direction residents parked their cars, to what colors they could display in their windows, to where they could walk and when. The rules seemed arbitrary and superstitious to outsiders, Evelyn admitted. But to the descendants of the original families, they were sacred obligations that protected the town from divine judgment and supernatural harm. Breaking the rules brought consequences, not from any human enforcement, but from the town itself. Or so the residents believed. Evelyn told Samuel about families who had violated major rules and had suffered house fires, accidents, and mysterious illnesses until they either left town or made proper amends. She told him about an outsider in the 1990s who had refused to follow the traditions and whose teenage daughter had vanished one night, never to be found. Though her screams had been heard throughout the town and no one had gone to investigate because it was after curfew and the rules forbade being outside after midnight. Samuel felt his blood run cold as Evelyn continued. She explained that he had unknowingly violated multiple sacred rules in his first weeks in town. He had walked past the Miller property, which was forbidden because 3 generations of that family had hanged themselves in the barn, and the ground was considered cursed. He had hung red curtains, which symbolized blood and violence in the town's symbolic language. He had parked facing west, which represented the direction of death and the setting sun. He had whistled after dark, which was believed to summon malevolent spirits that the founders had tried to keep outside the town boundaries. Each violation marked him as ignorant at best and actively hostile to the town's way of life at worst. The community had been patient, sending him warnings and giving him opportunities to correct his behavior. But his continued defiance had pushed them to the point where they had no choice but to take action. Evelyn told him that he needed to attend the town meeting on Saturday evening at the old church to make formal amends and commit himself to learning and following all the rules. If he refused, or if he did not attend, he would need to leave Millbrook before Sunday morning, or the town would make him leave through methods she would not specify, but that she promised he did not want to experience. Samuel left Evelyn's house shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything she had said as the delusions of an isolated community that had inbred itself into collective insanity. But another part of him, the part that had felt the watching eyes and experienced the coordinated ostracism and seen the immediate consequences of rule breaking, believed that these people were serious and potentially dangerous. He spent Friday packing his belongings, determined to leave this cursed town and never look back. To return to Louisville and rebuild his life somewhere, sane and normal. But when Saturday morning arrived and he tried to start his car, the engine would not turn over. He checked the battery, the alternator, the starter, everything he could think of with his limited mechanical knowledge. But the car was simply dead in a way that made no sense. When he called the only mechanic in town, the man laughed and hung up on him. When he tried to call a tow truck from the neighboring county, his cell phone lost signal, even though he had had perfect reception all month. That evening, as the sun began to set, Samuel stood at his front window and watched as the entire neighborhood gathered in the street outside his house. Men, women, and children, dozens of them, maybe more than 100, all dressed in dark clothes and all standing in perfect silence. They formed a semicircle around his property, facing his house, not moving, not speaking, just watching him with expressions he could not read in the fading light. He noticed with growing horror that many of them held objects. Ropes, shovels, lanterns, and items he could not identify, but that filled him with primal dread. Evelyn stood at the front of the crowd, her face sad but resolute. Samuel locked his doors and turned off his lights, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might have a heart attack. He called 911, but the operator who answered asked for his location. And when he said Millbrook, she paused for a long moment and then said that no such town existed in the county records, and she could not send help to a place that was not on the map. The line went dead, and his phone would not make another call. The crowd remained outside his house all night, standing in the street, watching and waiting. Samuel did not sleep. He sat in the darkness with a kitchen knife in his hand, listening to the silence and wondering what would happen when morning came. As dawn broke and light crept across the street, the crowd finally dispersed, melting away into their homes as if nothing had happened. Samuel found a final note slid under his door. It read, "The town meeting is tonight at 7. Your attendance is mandatory. This is your last chance to become part of Millbrook or to cease being anything at all." Samuel looked at his dead car, at his useless phone, at the empty street that had been filled with watching figures all night. He realized that he had no choice. He would go to the meeting. He would learn their rules. He would become whatever they wanted him to become. Because the alternative was something he could not bear to contemplate. And because he understood now that Millbrook did not let people leave once they had seen what lay beneath its peaceful surface. Aria was a 24-year-old freelance photographer who had built a modest following documenting the slow death of rural America through haunting images of abandoned main streets, shuttered factories, and communities that time had forgotten. She had traveled to Thornwick, a remote town of barely 600 residents tucked into the rain-soaked forests of the Oregon coast, after reading about it in a thread on a photography forum dedicated to vanishing American towns. The person who had mentioned Thornwick claimed it was one of the last truly isolated communities in the Pacific Northwest, a place where the population had been slowly dwindling for decades, and where the remaining residents clung to old ways with a determination that bordered on obsession. Aria had arrived on a gray October afternoon when the fog hung so thick between the massive Douglas firs that surrounded the town that she could barely see 50 feet in any direction. The town itself looked like it had been preserved in amber from the 1950s, with a single main street lined with brick buildings, an old movie theater with a marquee advertising a film from 1987, and a general store with a hand-painted sign that had weathered to near illegibility. But what immediately caught her attention was the frenzied activity taking place throughout the town. as residents prepared for what they called the Harvest Festival. The moment Arya parked her car in front of the only inn, a 3-story building with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged alarmingly, she was greeted by the innkeeper, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Margaret and who seemed almost desperately pleased to see a visitor. Margaret insisted on carrying Arya's bags personally, refused to accept payment for the room, and kept repeating how wonderful it was that Arya had arrived just in time for the festival. When Arya asked what the Harvest Festival entailed, Margaret's enthusiasm became even more pronounced, her words tumbling over each other as she described a celebration that had been held in Thornwick every year since the town's founding in 1889. It was a time of community bonding, Margaret explained, when everyone came together to give thanks for the harvest and to ensure the town's continued prosperity and protection. The festival would take place in 3 days, on the night of the new moon, and Margaret insisted that Arya simply had to stay and document it with her camera. It would be unlike anything she had ever photographed, Margaret promised. A genuine slice of authentic American tradition that had been preserved unchanged for over a century. Over the next 2 days, Arya explored Thornwick with her camera, capturing images of the festival preparations that struck her as increasingly bizarre and unsettling. The residents were constructing enormous effigies in the town square, human-shaped figures woven from branches and dried corn stalks that stood nearly 15 feet tall. At first glance, they appeared to be typical harvest decorations, the kind of folk art scarecrows one might see at any autumn festival. But as Arya examined them more closely through her telephoto lens, she noticed disturbing details that made her skin crawl. The faces of the effigies had been crafted with unsettling precision, their features so realistic that they seemed to be grimacing in pain or screaming in terror. The bodies were positioned in poses that suggested torture or execution, with arms twisted at unnatural angles and heads tilted back as if in their final moments of agony. Stranger still, each effigy wore clothing, not the simple burlap or rags one would expect, but actual garments that looked worn and lived in, as if they had been taken from real people. She noticed jeans with grass-stained knees, a jacket with a name tag still pinned to the breast, a pair of sneakers that showed signs of regular use. The symbols painted throughout the town disturbed Arya even more than the effigies. Every building, every lamppost, every fence had been marked with elaborate designs in what appeared to be a mixture of red paint and something organic that had a rust-brown color and a smell that made her gag when she got too close. The symbols were not decorative or festive. They were harsh geometric patterns interspersed with images that seemed to depict violence and suffering. Figures with their throats cut, bodies hanging from trees, circles of people surrounding a central form that appeared to be burning. When Arya asked Margaret about the meaning of the symbols, the innkeeper's cheerful demeanor faltered for just a moment, and she said that they were protective marks, traditional designs that kept the town safe from harm. But the way Margaret avoided making eye contact when she said it made Arya suspect there was far more to the story than she was being told. By the evening of the second day, Arya had decided she had enough photographs and was ready to leave Thornwick before the festival took place. Something about the town and its residents had begun to make her deeply uncomfortable in a way that went beyond simple unease. People watched her constantly, tracking her movements with an intensity that felt predatory. Conversations would stop when she approached, and residents would smile at her with expressions that never reached their eyes. When she told Margaret at dinner that she would be leaving early the next morning, the innkeeper's face transformed from friendly to something much colder and harder. Margaret insisted that Arya could not possibly leave before experiencing the festival. that it would be a grave insult to the community's hospitality, and that the roads out of town were far too dangerous to travel at night. When Arya pointed out that she would be leaving in the morning, not at night, Margaret's smile became fixed and unnatural. And she said that the roads were dangerous during the day as well, that strangers often became lost in the forest and were never found, and that it would be much safer for Arya to wait until after the festival when some of the local men could escort her to the county highway. The insistence felt less like hospitality and more like a threat, and Arya went to bed that night with her door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of activity outside her window as the townspeople continued their preparations through the night. She could hear chanting in a language she did not recognize, rhythmic and repetitive, punctuated by the sound of drums and what might have been bells or chains. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and she fell into a troubled sleep filled with nightmares of burning figures and symbols written in blood. When she woke just after dawn, she discovered that someone had been in her room while she slept. Her camera bag had been moved, though nothing appeared to be missing. Her car keys, which she had left on the nightstand, were now sitting on the windowsill, as if someone had picked them up and examined them. Most disturbing of all, there was a wreath of twisted branches and dried flowers hanging on the back of her door, and she knew with absolute certainty that it had not been there when she had gone to sleep. Arya grabbed her belongings and rushed downstairs, determined to get to her car and leave immediately, festival or no festival. Margaret's warnings be damned. But when she reached the lobby, she found it full of townspeople, at least 20 of them, all sitting in silence and all turning to look at her the moment she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Margaret stood at the front of the group, still wearing her unnaturally wide smile, and announced that everyone had come to invite Arya personally to be a guest of honor at the festival that evening. It was a tremendous privilege, Margaret said, one that had not been extended to an outsider in many years. Arya would have a special role in the ceremony, a part to play that would make her an integral part of Thornwick's continued prosperity. The way Margaret emphasized the word integral made it sound less like an honor and more like a sentence. Arya managed to maintain her composure and thanked the assembled residents for their kind invitation while explaining that she had a prior commitment and really did need to leave that morning. She could feel the temperature in the room drop as she spoke, could see the smiles on the faces around her harden into something resembling hostility. One of the men, a tall figure with hands that looked too large for his body, stood and moved to block the front door. Another man positioned himself at the back entrance to the inn. Margaret's voice took on a tone of patient correction as she explained that Arya did not seem to understand the situation. The festival required a certain number of participants to be effective, and they had counted on her presence when she had arrived so fortuitously 3 days before. The town had needs, Margaret said, and sometimes individuals had to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. It was the way things had always been done in Thornwick, and it was the way things would continue to be done. Panic began to claw at Arya's chest as she realized she was trapped in a room full of people who had no intention of letting her leave. She thought about screaming, but who would hear her in a town where everyone was complicit in whatever was happening? She thought about fighting her way to the door, but she was one person against dozens. Instead, she forced herself to smile and told Margaret that she had misunderstood, that she would of course be honored to participate in the festival, and that she had simply been concerned about imposing on the town's hospitality for longer than planned. The lie seemed to satisfy Margaret and the others, and the tension in the room eased slightly. The residents began to file out, each one touching Arya's shoulder or arm as they passed, their fingers lingering just a moment too long, their eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether her compliance was genuine. Once she was alone again, Arya went to her room and tried her cell phone. But there was no signal, which was not unusual in remote areas, but felt sinister under the circumstances. She went to the window and saw that her car was surrounded by people, not obviously guarding it, but positioned in such a way that she could not possibly reach it without being seen and stopped. She was truly trapped, and the realization made her want to vomit. She spent the rest of the day in her room, trying to formulate a plan, trying to understand what was really happening in Thornwick and what role these people intended her to play in their festival. When she searched through the room more carefully, she found something that made her blood freeze. Hidden behind the dresser was a backpack, dusty and clearly forgotten, with a Colorado driver's license in the front pocket belonging to a man named James Chen. According to the license, he had been 26 years old when it was issued in 2019. Arya searched online on her laptop using the weak Wi-Fi signal from the inn and found a missing person report filed in 2020 for James Chen, a travel photographer who had disappeared while documenting small towns in the Pacific Northwest. The last place his credit card had been used was at a gas station 40 miles from Thornwick. The discovery gave Arya the clarity and motivation she needed. Whatever happened at the Harvest Festival, it was not a harmless tradition, and she was not going to wait around to become another missing person whose belongings ended up hidden in the inn. As evening approached and she heard the sounds of the festival beginning in the town square, the drums and chanting growing louder, she made her decision. She would not try to escape through the front of the inn or to her car. Instead, she would go out through her second-floor window, climb down using the porch trellis, and make her way through the forest on foot. It was risky, and she might become lost in the vast wilderness that surrounded Thornwick. But it was a better option than staying and discovering what fate the townspeople had planned for her. She waited until the chanting reached a fever pitch, and she could hear that the entire town had gathered in the square for the ceremony. Then she opened her window as quietly as possible, threw her backpack with her laptop and camera down into the bushes below, and began to climb down the trellis. The wood was old and rotten, and it cracked alarmingly under her weight, but it held long enough for her to reach the ground. She retrieved her bag and began to run toward the tree line, moving as quickly and quietly as she could through the darkness. Behind her, she could hear the festival continuing, could see the orange glow of enormous fires burning in the town square, could smell smoke and something else, something chemical and wrong that made her run faster. She had nearly reached the safety of the forest when she heard the shout behind her. They had discovered her absence. She could hear voices calling her name, could hear the sound of people running, could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they began to search for her. Arya plunged into the forest and ran blindly through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her face and clothes, roots threatening to trip her with every step. She ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. Finally, she stopped behind a massive fallen log to catch her breath and listen for sounds of pursuit. She could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the sound of her own ragged breathing. It took her all night to find her way to the county highway, navigating by the stars when she could see them through the canopy, and by instinct when she could not. When she finally stumbled onto the paved road just after dawn, she flagged down the first vehicle she saw, a logging truck whose driver took one look at her torn clothes and terrified expression and agreed to take her to the nearest police station. She told the officers everything. About the festival, about the effigies, about James Chen's belongings, about being held against her will. They listened with expressions of professional skepticism and agreed to investigate. 3 days later, they told her that they had driven to the location she had described, but there was no town there. The road she had indicated led only to an abandoned logging camp that had been closed since the 1960s. There were no residents, no buildings, no evidence that anyone had been there in decades. When Arya insisted that she had photographs, she discovered that every image she had taken in Thornwick had been corrupted, replaced by static and darkness. The only proof she had was James Chen's driver's license, which she had grabbed from the backpack before climbing out the window. The police added it to his missing person file, but they made it clear they thought Arya had found it somewhere else and had constructed an elaborate story around it. Arya never went back to that part of Oregon, never tried to find Thornwick again, never spoke publicly about what had happened to her. But sometimes, late at night, she would search online for information about vanishing towns and missing people. And she would find others who told similar stories of communities that appeared and disappeared, of festivals that required participants, of escapes made just in time. And she would look at the one photograph that had survived the corruption of her memory card, an image she had taken on her first day in Thornwick that showed the town square with its brick buildings and hand-painted signs. If you looked closely at the edges of the frame, you could see figures standing in the shadows, watching the camera, waiting. This happened in 2019, but David still remembered every single detail about what he discovered quite vividly. It was so random and so distinctly horrifying that he would never forget what was hidden beneath Pinewood Community Church in rural Mississippi. The incident was so disturbing and so unexpected that it fundamentally changed how David viewed the communities he worked in and made him question how many other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of seemingly normal American towns. At the time, David was 28 years old and working as an independent contractor specializing in historical building renovation. He had built a solid reputation for restoring old churches throughout the South, preserving their architectural character while updating them to meet modern safety codes. When he received the call from Pastor Franklin of Pinewood Community Church, he had been pleased to take on the project. The church was over 100 years old, a beautiful white clapboard structure with Gothic Revival windows and a bell tower that had been featured in several books about Southern architecture. The congregation was small, maybe 40 regular attendees, in a town of 400 people. But they had raised enough money through bake sales and donations to afford necessary repairs to the sanctuary and the installation of updated electrical systems. David arrived in Pinewood on a Monday in June and met with Pastor Franklin, a man in his early 60s with a warm handshake and an easy smile that suggested a lifetime spent putting people at ease. The pastor gave David a complete tour of the building, showed him the areas that needed the most work, and explained the congregation's vision for the restoration. Everything seemed straightforward and professional. Pastor Franklin gave David keys to the building and told him he was welcome to work whatever hours he needed, including evenings and weekends when the church would be empty. The only restriction the pastor mentioned was that David should not go into the basement, which was not part of the renovation project, and which contained only old records and storage that the congregation would sort through themselves at a later date. The instructions seemed reasonable enough, and David agreed without hesitation. He had no reason to go into the basement if it was not part of his contracted work. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded smoothly. David worked during the evenings to avoid the brutal Mississippi heat, arriving around 6 in the afternoon and working until midnight or later. The church was indeed empty during those hours, and he appreciated the quiet and the ability to focus on detailed work without interruption. He repaired water damage in the sanctuary ceiling, replaced rotted window frames, and began the process of rewiring the electrical system to bring it up to code. It was satisfying work, the kind of project that allowed him to see tangible progress each day. But as he worked, he became increasingly aware of the basement door. It was located in a hallway between the sanctuary and the small kitchen area, and it was immediately obvious that the door was much newer than the rest of the building. While the church itself dated to the 1890s, this door appeared to be recent construction, perhaps only a few years old. It was solid core, the kind of heavy security door one might see in a commercial building, and it had 3 separate locks: a deadbolt, a keyed entry lock, and a sliding bolt at the top. David told himself that the door was none of his business, and that old churches often had quirks and modifications that reflected changing needs over decades. But his curiosity grew stronger as the days passed, particularly because he noticed that Pastor Franklin visited the church late at night on several occasions, always entering through the back door and always spending exactly 1 hour inside before leaving. David knew the pastor was there because he would see his car parked behind the building, and he could hear footsteps and the sound of the basement door opening and closing. It struck him as odd behavior for a pastor whose only explanation for the basement had been that it contained old records and storage. Why would someone need to visit old records in the middle of the night? And why would storage require a door with 3 separate locks? The discovery happened on a Thursday evening in his 4th week on the project. David was working on replacing electrical outlets in the hallway when he noticed that the basement door was slightly ajar, the deadbolt not fully engaged. He assumed that Pastor Franklin had visited earlier and had forgotten to secure it properly. David's first instinct was to simply close the door and go back to work. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small oddities he had noticed over the past weeks. Or perhaps it was simple human curiosity. But he found himself pushing the door open and looking down the basement stairs. The stairs were wooden and old, consistent with the age of the building. But they had been recently reinforced and were in excellent condition. A light was on at the bottom of the stairs, casting a pale yellow glow that did nothing to dispel the sense of wrongness that had begun to creep over David. He descended the stairs slowly, telling himself that he was simply making sure everything was secure and that there was nothing inappropriate about checking on a part of the building where he was working. The basement was larger than he had expected, a series of connected rooms that extended under the entire footprint of the church. The first room contained exactly what Pastor Franklin had described: boxes of old records, Christmas decorations, folding tables and chairs, and the accumulated detritus of decades of church activities. But there was another door at the far end of this room, and this door was also heavy and secure, though it stood open now. David walked through it and found himself in a space that made his blood run cold, and his professional instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The room had been converted into living quarters, but not the kind that suggested voluntary occupancy. There was a twin bed with a bare mattress and a thin blanket. There was a small toilet in the corner, the kind one might find in a prison cell, with no privacy screen or door. There were supplies stacked against one wall: cases of bottled water, canned foods, and what appeared to be medical supplies, including bandages and bottles of pills. But most disturbing were the restraints. Heavy chains had been bolted to the concrete wall, with cuffs that could secure a person's wrists and ankles. The walls were marked with scratches, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the concrete in desperation. And there were children's toys scattered on the floor: a stuffed bear with matted fur, a coloring book with pages torn out, crayons worn down to nubs. The room smelled of bleach and something underneath the chemical scent, something organic and wrong that made David want to vomit. David pulled out his phone with shaking hands and began photographing everything. He documented the restraints, the living conditions, the supplies, the scratches on the walls, every detail that would serve as evidence of what he had found. His mind was racing with horror and disbelief. This was not old storage. This was a prison. Someone had been kept here, possibly multiple people over time, and the presence of children's items suggested victims who were young and vulnerable. As he photographed the final corner of the room, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. Footsteps at the top of the basement stairs. Someone had entered the church above him. David froze, every instinct telling him to hide, to run, to do anything but be discovered in this room where he was explicitly told not to go. He heard the footsteps descending the stairs, heard them crossing the first basement room, and then Pastor Franklin appeared in the doorway. The transformation in the pastor's demeanor was immediate and chilling. The warm, friendly expression vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of humanity. Pastor Franklin looked at David, looked at the phone in his hand, and said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever that David had made a terrible mistake. The pastor began to explain that some people in the community required correction and guidance, that the basement served a holy purpose in rehabilitating those who had strayed from righteousness, and that outsiders could never understand the difficult work that the church performed in keeping the town pure and godly. David did not wait to hear more. He shoved past Pastor Franklin with all the strength he could muster, knocking the older man off balance and sending him stumbling into the wall. David ran through the first basement room, up the stairs, and out of the church to his truck. His hands shook so badly that he could barely get the key in the ignition. But he managed to start the vehicle and drive directly to the county sheriff's office 20 miles away. He told them everything, showed them the photographs on his phone, and insisted that they needed to investigate immediately. The deputies listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to horror as they looked at the images. They contacted state police and child protective services, and within hours, a full investigation team descended on Pinewood Community Church. What they found confirmed everything David had photographed, and worse. Forensic analysis revealed that the basement room had been used for years, possibly decades. DNA evidence linked the room to 3 missing children from surrounding counties, cases that had gone cold years earlier. Further investigation revealed that Pastor Franklin was part of a network that extended beyond Pinewood, involving multiple churches and multiple towns throughout rural Mississippi. The children had been taken under the guise of religious correction or reformation, held in basement prisons beneath churches, and subjected to abuse that the investigation reports described in terms so clinical that they failed to capture the true horror of what had happened. The congregation members were interviewed extensively. Some claimed complete ignorance. Others admitted they had suspected something but had been too afraid to speak out against church leadership that had controlled the town for generations. Pastor Franklin was arrested, along with 2 deacons and several congregation members who had been complicit in the crimes. The trial stretched over 2 years, with testimony that revealed a system of abuse that had operated in plain sight, hidden beneath a church that the community had trusted and supported. David testified at the trials, describing what he had found and how the discovery had unfolded. The accused were convicted and received sentences that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. But David knew that no amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done or bring back the years that had been stolen from children who had been imprisoned beneath a place that was supposed to represent sanctuary and hope. David never worked on another church restoration project after Pinewood. He could not bring himself to enter those spaces anymore without wondering what might be hidden in their basements or locked rooms. The experience had shown him that evil could wear any face and hide behind any institution, and that the most horrifying monsters were often the ones who stood in pulpits and smiled at their congregations every Sunday while keeping unspeakable secrets locked away in the darkness below. This happened when Evelyn had just moved to Coopersville, a dying mining town in West Virginia with a population that had dwindled to barely 300 souls clinging to a place that the rest of the world had forgotten. The town had been built in the 1920s around a coal mine that had provided employment for thousands of workers at its peak. But the mine had closed in 1987, and since then, Coopersville had been slowly hemorrhaging residents until only the most stubborn, the most poor, or the most trapped remained. Evelyn was 29 years old and had taken a job as a waitress at the Bluebird Diner, the only restaurant still operating in town, because she had fled an abusive relationship in Pittsburgh and needed a place where her ex-boyfriend would never think to look for her. Coopersville was certainly that. It was the kind of place that people left, not the kind of place anyone moved to by choice. And her co-workers at the diner had regarded her arrival with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as if they could not imagine what desperation would drive someone to voluntarily relocate to their dying town. The Bluebird Diner sat on Route 52, the two-lane highway that connected Coopersville to the larger towns in the valley below. The highway was the town's lifeline, its only real connection to the outside world. And it was also its curse. The road had been built in the 1930s, carved into the side of the mountain with hairpin turns and steep grades that made it treacherous even in good weather. In winter, when ice coated the asphalt and fog reduced visibility to almost nothing, the highway became a death trap. Evelyn learned during her first week of work that the stretch of Route 52 that ran through Coopersville had one of the highest accident fatality rates in the state. The evidence was impossible to miss. Both sides of the highway were lined with memorials, small white crosses and larger monuments marking the spots where people had died in crashes. Some were simple, just a name and a date. Others were elaborate, with flowers that were regularly replaced, photographs in weatherproof frames, stuffed animals, and personal items left by grieving families. Evelyn's daily commute to the diner took her past dozens of these memorials, and after a few weeks, she began to recognize individual ones and to learn the stories behind them from her co-workers and regular customers. There was the memorial for the Johnson family, all 5 of them killed when their van went off the road during a blizzard in 2003. There was the cross for Tommy Bryant, a 17-year-old who had been drag racing and had lost control on a curve in 1999. There was the elaborate stone marker for Elizabeth Crane, a young mother who had been killed by a drunk driver in 2015, leaving behind 3 children. The memorials were a constant reminder of how dangerous the road was, how many lives it had claimed, and Evelyn found herself driving with extreme caution, her hands tight on the steering wheel and her eyes constantly scanning for hazards. But there was one memorial that drew her attention more than the others, and she could not quite explain why. It was located at a sharp curve about halfway between her apartment and the diner, a spot where the highway bent around the mountainside and the shoulder dropped away into a steep ravine filled with trees and rocks. The memorial was old, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements, and it consisted of a white wooden cross with a name barely visible through the peeling paint. Sarah Miller, 1987. There were no flowers, no photographs, no personal items. Just the cross standing alone in the weeds at the edge of the pavement. What made it stand out to Evelyn was the figure she began to see standing beside it. The first time she saw the figure was during her second week in Coopersville, on a cold morning in early March when fog hung thick across the road and visibility was poor. As Evelyn navigated the curve where Sarah Miller's memorial stood, she glimpsed what appeared to be a person standing on the shoulder near the cross. The figure was indistinct in the fog, just a dark shape that might have been a person or might have been a trick of the light in the swirling mist. Evelyn slowed her car, concerned that someone might need help or might step into the road. But as she drew closer, the figure seemed to fade back into the fog and disappear. She told herself she had imagined it, that the combination of poor visibility and her own nervousness about the dangerous road had made her see things that were not there. But the figure appeared again the next morning, and the morning after that, always in the same spot near Sarah Miller's memorial, always visible only in her peripheral vision or through the fog. Evelyn began to notice a pattern. The figure appeared only at dawn, only when she was driving to work, and only at that specific location. If she looked directly at it, it seemed to become less distinct, almost transparent. But if she glanced at it from the corner of her eye, it appeared solid and real. The figure was always standing in the same position, facing the road as if waiting for something or watching for someone. Evelyn could not make out any details of face or clothing, could not even be certain of the figure's gender or age. But she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from it, a grief so profound that it seemed to saturate the air around the memorial. By the third week, Evelyn had convinced herself that she was experiencing some kind of psychological phenomenon, perhaps a manifestation of her own trauma and stress projected onto the landscape. She had been through a difficult period in her life, and it would not be surprising if her mind was playing tricks on her, creating phantoms out of fog and shadow. She mentioned the figure casually to one of her co-workers at the diner, a woman named Ruth who had lived in Coopersville her entire life and who seemed to know everything about everyone in town. Ruth's reaction was immediate and unsettling. Her face went pale, and she grabbed Evelyn's arm with surprising strength and asked her exactly what she had seen and exactly where. When Evelyn described the figure and the location of Sarah Miller's memorial, Ruth released her arm and took a step back, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. Ruth explained that Evelyn was not the first person to see the figure at Sarah Miller's memorial, and she would not be the last. Sarah Miller had been 19 years old in 1987 when she was killed in a hit-and-run accident at that exact spot on the highway. The driver had never been caught, had never been identified, and had never faced justice for taking Sarah's life. According to Ruth and other longtime residents of Coopersville, Sarah's ghost had been appearing at the site of her death ever since, always at dawn, always standing near her memorial. But she did not appear to everyone. She only appeared to specific people, to drivers who shared certain characteristics with the man who had killed her. Ruth would not specify exactly what those characteristics were, saying only that Sarah appeared to those who looked like her killer, and that her appearances were a warning or perhaps an accusation. The revelation should have frightened Evelyn, should have made her avoid that section of highway or change her route to work. But instead, it made her angry. The idea that she somehow resembled a hit-and-run driver, that she was being haunted or accused because of a superficial similarity to a person who had committed a terrible crime decades ago, seemed profoundly unfair. She began to deliberately look for the figure each morning, to stare directly at the memorial as she drove past, almost daring the ghost to show itself clearly. And the figure obliged. Each day it became more distinct, more solid, more present. By the fourth week, Evelyn could make out details. A young woman with long dark hair, wearing jeans and a jacket, standing with her arms at her sides and her face turned toward the road. The figure never moved, never gestured, never acknowledged Evelyn's presence in any obvious way. But Evelyn felt watched, felt judged, felt the weight of that silent accusation growing heavier with each passing day. Then the figure began to move closer to the road. Each morning it stood a few inches nearer to the pavement, a few inches closer to the path of Evelyn's car. The progression was subtle but unmistakable, and Evelyn realized with growing dread that the ghost was not content to simply watch anymore. By the end of the 4th week, the figure was standing at the very edge of the shoulder, so close to the road that Evelyn had to swerve slightly to avoid the spot where it stood. And then, on a Monday morning in late March, the figure stepped directly into the road in front of Evelyn's car. Evelyn saw the young woman materialize in the center of her lane, solid and real, her face finely visible and contorted in an expression of rage and grief. Evelyn screamed and jerked the steering wheel to the right, trying to avoid hitting the figure, but her car was traveling too fast on the dangerous curve. The vehicle skidded on the damp pavement, the tires losing traction, and Evelyn felt the sickening sensation of the car sliding sideways toward the edge of the road and the steep drop beyond. She managed to regain partial control and bring the car to a stop on the shoulder, her heart pounding and her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the steering wheel. When she looked in her rearview mirror, the figure was gone, and the road behind her was empty. Evelyn sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to calm down enough to drive the rest of the way to work. When she finally arrived at the diner, pale and shaken, Ruth took one look at her and pulled her into the back office. Evelyn told her what had happened, about the figure stepping into the road, about nearly going over the edge, about the terrible expression on the ghost's face. Ruth listened with the resigned air of someone who had heard similar stories before. She told Evelyn that Sarah Miller had caused accidents before, that she appeared to drivers and made them swerve, that 3 people had died at that same curve since Sarah's own death in circumstances eerily similar to Evelyn's near miss. The local police knew about it, Ruth said. But what could they do? How could they stop a ghost? How could they protect people from something that had no physical form and no rational explanation? Ruth advised Evelyn to take a different route to work, even if it meant adding 20 minutes to her commute by going around the mountain on back roads. But Evelyn discovered that avoiding Sarah Miller's memorial was not enough. The ghost followed her. On her new route, Evelyn began to see the same dark-haired figure standing at different roadside memorials, always watching, always waiting. She learned that there were 3 other memorials along Route 52 where similar stories were told, 3 other sites where the ghosts of accident victims appeared to drivers and caused them to crash. Coopersville's dangerous highway was haunted by the dead who had died there, and they were not resting peacefully. They were angry, and they were making the living pay for crimes both real and imagined. Evelyn lasted another 2 months in Coopersville before the constant fear and the recurring appearances of the roadside ghosts drove her to quit her job and leave town. She moved to a city in Ohio, as far from mountain highways and rural roads as she could get. And she never drove Route 52 again. But sometimes, when she was driving at dawn and saw a roadside memorial, she would feel a chill and would see, just at the edge of her vision, a figure standing and watching. The ghosts of Coopersville had marked her somehow, had claimed her as one of the people who looked like the ones who had wronged them, and she wondered if she would ever truly escape their silent accusations. When Joseph was 16 years old, his family moved to Grantsville, a town of just 500 people in rural Idaho, where his father had taken a job as a supervisor at the lumber mill that was the only significant employer for 50 miles in any direction. Joseph had not wanted to move. He had friends and a life back in Boise, and the idea of spending his last 2 years of high school in a town that was smaller than his old high school student body filled him with dread. But his father's new position came with a significant pay increase and the promise of job security, and after years of financial struggle, the family had no choice but to relocate. They moved into a modest 2-story house on Spruce Street in late August, just 2 weeks before school was scheduled to start. And Joseph resigned himself to being the new kid in a place where everyone else had known each other since kindergarten. The first people they met were their next-door neighbors, the Rogers family. They lived in a house that was slightly larger and much better maintained than Joseph's family's rental, with a manicured lawn and fresh paint that spoke to old money and established position in the small town's social hierarchy. Mr. Rogers owned the hardware store on Main Street, and Mrs. Rogers worked as the secretary at the high school, which meant that within a day of moving in, Joseph's mother knew where to shop and who to talk to about registering Joseph for classes. The Rogers had one son, Carter, who was also 16 and who would be in Joseph's grade when school started. Mrs. Rogers suggested that Carter could show Joseph around town and introduce him to other kids their age, and Carter seemed enthusiastic about the prospect. Greeting Joseph with a wide smile and an immediate invitation to come over and hang out. For the first week, having Carter as a guide to Grantsville seemed like a stroke of good fortune. Carter knew everyone and everything about the town. He showed Joseph the few places where teenagers gathered: the swimming hole in the creek behind the abandoned grain elevator, the parking lot at the grocery store where kids hung out on Friday nights, the hiking trails in the forest that surrounded the town on 3 sides. Carter introduced Joseph to other students who would be in their classes, and he vouched for Joseph's character in a way that seemed to smooth his acceptance into the social fabric of the high school. Joseph's parents were pleased that their son had made a friend so quickly, and they encouraged the relationship, inviting Carter over for dinner and praising him for being such a good influence. But as the second week progressed, Joseph began to notice aspects of Carter's behavior that made him uncomfortable. Carter had a way of showing up uninvited, appearing at Joseph's door at odd hours without calling first, or asking if it was a convenient time to visit. He would let himself into Joseph's house through the back door, which the family had not yet gotten into the habit of locking. And Joseph would discover Carter sitting in his room going through his belongings or reading his journal. When Joseph expressed surprise or mild annoyance at these intrusions, Carter would laugh and say that this was how things were done in small towns, that people did not stand on ceremony or worry about privacy the way they did in cities. Joseph tried to accept this explanation, tried to adjust his expectations to match what Carter insisted were normal small-town behaviors. But something about Carter's constant presence felt wrong in a way that Joseph struggled to articulate. The situation escalated after school started. Carter arranged his schedule so that he shared every possible class with Joseph, and he positioned himself so that they were always paired for group projects and lab assignments. He sat next to Joseph at lunch and discouraged other students from joining their table, creating an insular dynamic that left Joseph socially isolated, except for his connection to Carter. When Joseph tried to make other friends or spend time with different people, Carter would become visibly upset, accusing Joseph of being disloyal and reminding him that Carter was the only person who had been kind to him when he was new and friendless. The accusations stung because they contained an element of truth, and Joseph found himself apologizing and promising to be a better friend even though he could not identify what he had done wrong. Joseph's parents worked long hours, his father at the mill and his mother at a medical clinic in the next town over, which meant that Joseph was alone at home most afternoons and evenings. Carter began spending these unsupervised hours at Joseph's house, doing homework together or watching television. And while Joseph appreciated the company at first, he gradually realized that Carter's presence was not optional. If Joseph tried to say he had too much work to hang out or that he wanted some time alone, Carter would show up anyway, letting himself in through the back door and acting as if no refusal had been given. Joseph stopped locking his bedroom door because Carter would simply wait in the hallway or sit on the stairs outside Joseph's room until Joseph gave in and let him enter. The behavior felt increasingly possessive and controlling. But when Joseph tried to talk to his parents about it, they dismissed his concerns, said that Carter was just being a good friend and that Joseph should be grateful to have someone who cared about him so much. The situation reached a disturbing turning point in late September when Carter invited Joseph to see his room, which he had not shown Joseph before, despite Joseph having shown Carter his own room dozens of times. Joseph followed Carter next door and up to the second floor of the Rogers house, and when Carter opened his bedroom door, Joseph felt his stomach drop. The walls of Carter's room were covered with images of Joseph. There were photographs that Carter must have taken without Joseph's knowledge, printed and arranged in careful grids that covered entire walls. There were drawings of Joseph in various poses and settings, some realistic and some stylized, all executed with disturbing skill and attention to detail. There was a collage made from items that Joseph recognized as things he had lost or misplaced over the past month. A pen, a notebook, a t-shirt, a bracelet he had thought he left at school. Most disturbing were the writings, journal entries, and poetry that Carter had written about Joseph, describing feelings and fantasies that made Joseph's skin crawl and made him realize that Carter's attachment was not normal friendship, but something much darker and more obsessive. Joseph left Carter's house immediately, making an excuse about forgetting something and practically running back to his own home. He locked all the doors and windows, his hands shaking and his mind racing with horror at what he had seen. He tried calling his parents, but neither answered their phones, and he was left alone with the knowledge that Carter lived 20 feet away and knew every habit and vulnerability that Joseph had. Joseph tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that the shrine was weird but not necessarily dangerous, that maybe this was how Carter expressed friendship and Joseph was interpreting it through an urban lens that did not account for rural social norms. But even as he tried to rationalize what he had seen, Joseph knew that something was profoundly wrong. That evening, Carter came to Joseph's door and knocked repeatedly, calling Joseph's name and asking why he had left so suddenly. Joseph did not answer, pretending he was not home. But he could see through the window that Carter was not fooled. Carter stood on the porch for over an hour, occasionally trying the door handle and peering through the windows, his expression shifting from confusion to hurt to something that looked like anger. When Joseph's parents finally came home around 9 o'clock, Carter was gone, but there was a note taped to the front door. It read, "You cannot avoid me. We are meant to be together. You will understand eventually." The note was written in the same handwriting that had covered the walls of Carter's room, and it was signed with both their names as if they were a unit. Carter and Joseph forever. Joseph showed his parents the note and tried to explain about the shrine in Carter's room, but his father dismissed it as teenage drama, and his mother suggested that Joseph had misunderstood Carter's intentions and that the images were probably just art projects for school. They refused to take the situation seriously, and Joseph realized with growing despair that he was on his own. Over the next 2 weeks, Carter's behavior became increasingly aggressive and unstable. He followed Joseph between classes, stood outside Joseph's house at night, and left gifts and notes in Joseph's locker that ranged from romantic to threatening. When Joseph tried to avoid him, Carter would corner him in empty hallways or bathrooms, demanding to know why Joseph was being cruel and insisting that they had a special connection that Joseph was betraying. The situation finally came to a head in mid-October, when Joseph woke at 2 a.m. to find Carter standing in his bedroom. Carter had broken in through a window that Joseph had thought was locked, and he was holding a knife that he said was to protect them both from people who would try to keep them apart. Joseph screamed, and his father came running, wrestling the knife away from Carter and calling the police. Carter was arrested and charged with breaking and entering and assault with a weapon. During the investigation that followed, police discovered that Carter had a history of obsessive behavior toward other boys, a pattern that had been carefully hidden and managed by the Rogers family and by community members who had chosen to protect the family's reputation rather than address Carter's dangerous psychological issues. The investigation revealed that 2 families had quietly left Grantsville in the previous 5 years after their teenage sons had been targeted by Carter in ways similar to what Joseph had experienced. In both cases, the Rogers family had used their influence and money to convince the families to relocate rather than press charges or create a scandal. The town had been complicit in enabling Carter's behavior, valuing social harmony and the protection of a prominent family over the safety of vulnerable teenagers. The discovery filled Joseph with rage and a sense of betrayal not just by Carter, but by an entire community that had knowingly allowed a predator to operate among them. Carter was eventually sentenced to psychiatric treatment and probation, a punishment that Joseph's family and many others felt was inadequate given the severity of his actions and the pattern of behavior that had been documented. Joseph's family moved out of Grantsville before Christmas, unable to remain in a town that had protected their son's stalker and that continued to treat the Rogers family with deference and sympathy. Joseph carried the trauma of those months with him for years, struggling with trust and hypervigilance and anger at the adults who had failed to protect him. The experience taught him that small towns could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with crime rates or stranger danger, that the worst threats often came from within communities that closed ranks to protect their own and sacrificed outsiders to maintain an illusion of respectability and peace. Scarlett had been meaning to tell this story for years, but something had always stopped her. Some combination of fear and doubt and the creeping suspicion that no one would believe what had happened to her in Asherton, Texas. The incident had occurred in the summer of 2021 when she was 25 years old and traveling cross-country from California to North Carolina to start a new job as a graphic designer. She had decided to take the southern route and make a road trip out of it, stopping in small towns along the way to photograph interesting architecture and local landmarks for her personal portfolio. The plan had been to drive through the empty stretches of West Texas in one long push, stopping only for gas and food. But her car had other ideas. Somewhere between El Paso and San Antonio, on a desolate stretch of highway where the landscape was nothing but scrub brush and heat shimmer, her engine had started making a grinding noise that quickly escalated into a mechanical death rattle that forced her to pull over. She had managed to coast into Asherton, a town so small that it barely qualified as a town at all. The population sign at the town limits read 189, and from what Scarlett could see as she limped her dying car down Main Street, that number seemed optimistic. There was a gas station that looked abandoned, a post office that was open only 3 days a week according to the faded sign in the window, a general store with dusty windows displaying products that appeared not to have been moved in decades, and nothing else except houses that ranged from merely neglected to actively collapsing. The mechanic's shop was a single bay garage attached to someone's house, and the mechanic, an older man, who introduced himself simply as Frank, took one look under her hood and delivered the bad news. She had blown a gasket and cracked something important, and the parts would need to be ordered from San Antonio. It would take at least 3 days for them to arrive, possibly longer because it was a holiday weekend and shipping would be delayed. Scarlett felt panic rising in her chest. She had no family or friends within 500 miles. Her new job started in 10 days, and she could not afford to stay in a hotel for 3 days while waiting for car parts. Frank must have seen the distress on her face because he mentioned that Victoria Morris, a widow who lived at the edge of town, sometimes rented out a room to travelers who found themselves stranded in Asherton. The price would be reasonable, Frank assured her, and Victoria was a respectable woman who kept a clean house. Scarlett had no better options, so she accepted Frank's offer to call Victoria and arrange for her to stay there. Within an hour, she found herself standing on the porch of a weathered Victorian house that sat at the very end of a dirt road, separated from the rest of Asherton by at least a quarter mile of empty land. Victoria was a woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a manner that was polite but not warm. She showed Scarlett to a small bedroom on the second floor, quoted a price of $20 per night, and then delivered a warning that Scarlett did not fully understand at the time. Victoria said that Asherton was a quiet town where people minded their own business, and that Scarlett should not ask questions about the last house or about the people who had stayed in this room before her. The warning should have been a red flag, should have sent Scarlett running back to Frank's garage to sleep in her broken car if necessary. But exhaustion and heat and the lack of alternatives made her ignore her instincts. She agreed to Victoria's terms, paid for 3 nights in advance, and settled into the room. It was clean and sparsely furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a chair. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, and cell phone reception was almost non-existent. Scarlett unpacked her minimal belongings and lay down to rest, telling herself that 3 days would pass quickly and that this was just an unfortunate but temporary inconvenience in her journey. But that evening, as the sun set and the house settled into darkness, she heard a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found a teenage boy standing in the hallway. He was perhaps 16 or 17, thin and nervous, with eyes that darted around as if he was afraid of being caught. He introduced himself as Owen and said that he needed to talk to her immediately, that it was urgent and potentially a matter of life and death. Owen told her a story that seemed insane, but that he delivered with such genuine terror that Scarlett could not dismiss it. He said that Victoria's house, which locals called the last house because of its isolated position at the edge of town, had a dark history. Over the past decade, 5 people had rented that exact room where Scarlett was now staying. All 5 had been travelers passing through Asherton. All 5 had been young and alone, and all 5 had disappeared without a trace. Their cars would be gone from Frank's garage in the morning. Their belongings would be cleared from the room, and if anyone asked, Victoria would say they had decided to leave early and had paid their bill and departed. But Owen's older brother had been one of those renters 3 years ago, and Owen knew that his brother would never have left without calling home, would never have abandoned his car, which was later found at a junkyard in Mexico with the VIN numbers filed off. Owen had been investigating his brother's disappearance for years, and he had found evidence that Victoria was not working alone, that there was something organized and deliberate happening in Asherton, and that Scarlett needed to leave immediately before she became the 6th victim. Scarlett wanted to believe that Owen was exaggerating or paranoid or suffering from unresolved grief over his brother's disappearance. But something in his desperation convinced her to take him seriously. She asked him why he had not gone to the police, and Owen laughed bitterly and said that the sheriff was Victoria's cousin, and that everyone in Asherton either participated in or turned a blind eye to whatever was happening at the last house. He urged her to leave with him right then, said he would drive her to the next town where she could call for a tow truck or rent a car or do anything except stay in Victoria's house for another night. Scarlett agreed and began throwing her belongings into her bag. But before they could leave the room, they heard Victoria's voice calling from downstairs, asking if everything was all right and saying that she had heard voices. Owen's face went white, and he whispered that they needed to go immediately, that Victoria must not know that he had warned Scarlett. They tried to leave through the bedroom window, but it was painted shut and would not open. They tried the back stairs, but Victoria was standing at the bottom, blocking their exit. Scarlett realized with sick certainty that she was trapped, that Owen's presence had alerted Victoria to the fact that her pattern had been disrupted, and that whatever happened to the previous renters was about to happen to her. But Owen, who knew the house from years of secret investigation, grabbed Scarlett's hand and pulled her into a closet, then pushed aside a false back panel that revealed a narrow space between the walls. They squeezed into the gap and pulled the panel shut behind them just as they heard Victoria entering the bedroom. They could hear her searching the room, opening drawers and checking under the bed, muttering to herself about interference and schedules and how the boy was becoming a problem that needed to be solved. They waited in the darkness between the walls for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When they finally heard Victoria go back downstairs, Owen led Scarlett through the gap to a place where it opened into the basement. What Scarlett saw there confirmed every terrible thing Owen had told her. The basement contained belongings that clearly did not belong to Victoria. Suitcases, backpacks, personal items, and most damning of all, identification documents. Scarlett saw driver's licenses and passports belonging to people she did not know. But Owen identified his brother's wallet among the collection. Scarlett used her phone to photograph everything, every piece of evidence she could capture in the low light. Then Owen led her out through a basement window, and they ran to his truck, which he had parked a quarter-mile away to avoid being seen. Owen drove Scarlett to the state police barracks in the next county, and she filed a report describing everything she had seen and providing the photographs from her phone. The investigation that followed revealed that Victoria Morris had been operating a scheme targeting stranded travelers for over 15 years. The victims' vehicles were sold to Chop-e-Sal shops, their belongings were kept as trophies, and their identities were used for various forms of fraud. Authorities were never able to determine what had actually happened to the victims themselves. No bodies were ever found, and Victoria refused to cooperate or provide any information. She was convicted based on the physical evidence and sentenced to life in prison. But the fate of the people who had stayed in the last house remained a mystery that haunted Scarlett. The story should have ended there, but it did not. 6 months after Victoria's conviction, Scarlett began receiving phone calls from an unknown number with an Asherton area code. When she answered, there would be breathing on the other end, but no voice, just the sound of someone listening. The calls came at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during her workday, always from a number that could not be traced and that was disconnected whenever she tried to call it back. The calls continued for years, sometimes stopping for months at a time before resuming with renewed frequency. Scarlett changed her number 3 times, but somehow the calls always found her again. She could never prove that they were connected to what had happened in Asherton, could never explain how someone was getting her new numbers or why they were targeting her. But she knew in her bones that she had uncovered something in that town the powerful people wanted kept secret, and that they were reminding her that they knew where she was and could reach her whenever they chose. Zoe was a 27-year-old journalist from Seattle who had built a respectable career investigating fringe communities and unexplained phenomena for a regional alternative newspaper that specialized in long-form investigative pieces. She was very used to chasing strange stories, and over the past 5 years she had covered everything from cult compounds in eastern Washington to unsolved disappearances along the Canadian border to rumors of organized crime networks operating in logging towns. Her editor valued her willingness to go places other journalists would not, and to ask questions that made people uncomfortable. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would encounter in Coldwater, Montana, a town that existed on paper, but seemed to defy every rational explanation for how communities functioned. The story that brought Zoe to Coldwater came from a reader tip, an anonymous email sent to the newspaper's general inbox that described a town with an emergency broadcast system that activated at random intervals with instructions that residents followed without question or explanation. The tipster claimed to have driven through Coldwater once and had heard the broadcast warning people to stay inside and turn off their lights, which every resident had immediately obeyed as if it were a practice drill. The email provided coordinates, but no other contact information. And when Zoe tried to research the town online, she found almost nothing beyond a mention in a 1970 census report that listed Coldwater's population as 342. There were no recent news articles, no social media presence, no business listings. Nothing that suggested the town still existed or that anyone who lived there interacted with the outside world. Zoe arrived in Coldwater on a gray afternoon in late September after driving for 7 hours through increasingly remote mountain roads that wound through national forest land and private timber holdings. The town appeared suddenly around a curve, a cluster of perhaps 50 buildings arranged along a single main street with residential houses spreading out into the surrounding hills. Everything looked functional but dated, as if Coldwater had been frozen in time around 1985 and had not changed or modernized since then. The cars parked along the street were old models. The storefronts had hand-painted signs, and there was no visible cell phone tower or satellite dishes that would indicate modern connectivity. Zoe checked into the only motel, a single-story building with 8 units arranged in an L shape around a gravel parking lot. The clerk who registered her was a man in his 40s who spoke in monosyllables and avoided making eye contact, taking her cash payment without asking for identification or having her sign any paperwork. Zoe spent the first day walking through Coldwater and attempting to conduct interviews with residents about the emergency broadcast system. Her reception was uniformly cold and suspicious. People would see her approaching with her notebook and camera and would immediately turn and walk in the other direction. Shop owners would suddenly remember they were closing early when she tried to enter their businesses. The few people who would speak to her at all insisted that there was no emergency broadcast system and that she must be thinking of some other town. But Zoe noticed details that contradicted their denials. Every building had speakers mounted on the exterior walls. Old-fashioned loudspeakers like the kind used for tornado warnings in the Midwest. Every residence had blackout curtains in every window. Heavy fabric that would block all interior light from being visible outside. And most tellingly, everyone she encountered seemed nervous and kept glancing at their watches or at the sky as if anticipating something. The emergency siren went off at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, jolting Zoe awake from a light sleep in her motel room. The sound was deafening, a mechanical wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. And it was followed by a recorded voice speaking through the loudspeakers mounted throughout the town. The voice was male, flat and emotionless, and it delivered instructions with the authority of someone who expected absolute compliance. Lock your doors, turn off your lights, Do not look outside. Do not attempt to leave your homes. Do not make any sound. This will continue until the all-clear signal is given. The message repeated 3 times, and then the siren stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete that Zoe could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Zoe went to her window and carefully pulled back the curtain to look outside. The town was completely dark, every light extinguished, every window covered. The only illumination came from the moon, which cast everything in shades of silver and black. She could see nothing moving, no cars, no people, no animals, nothing but empty streets and shuttered buildings. The silence was oppressive and wrong, as if the entire town was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to pass. Zoe stood at the window for perhaps 10 minutes, watching and waiting. And then the all-clear signal sounded, a single long tone from the sirens. And within seconds, lights began to appear in windows throughout Coldwater, as if nothing unusual had happened. The next morning, Zoe tried to ask the motel clerk about the broadcast, but he simply stated that she must have been dreaming and that there had been no siren during the night. His denial was so blatant and so obviously false that Zoe felt a chill of real fear. Something was happening in Coldwater, something that every resident knew about and participated in, and they were all committed to keeping it secret from outsiders. She spent the day exploring the edges of town, looking for any clue that would explain the broadcast and the collective behavior it triggered. She found nothing except more speakers, dozens of them positioned throughout the residential areas and along the roads, all connected to underground cables that led toward a building at the center of town that appeared to be some kind of communications hub or radio station. The broadcast came again that night, and the night after, always at 3 in the morning, always with the same instructions delivered in the same emotionless voice. But on the 3rd night, the message included an additional instruction that made Zoe's blood freeze. A violation has been detected in Unit 6. Compliance will be enforced. Unit 6 was 2 doors down from Zoe's room, and she watched through her window as the lights in that unit went dark in the middle of the all-clear period. She heard nothing, no sounds of struggle or alarm. But when morning came, the car that had been parked outside Unit 6 was gone. And when she asked the clerk about it, he insisted that no one had been staying in that unit and that Zoe was mistaken about what she had seen. Zoe realized that she needed to leave Coldwater immediately, that whatever was happening in this town was dangerous, and that her presence had been noticed and was being tolerated only as long as she did not interfere or break the rules. But when she tried to drive out of town on the 4th morning, she found the road blocked by orange construction barriers and signs indicating that the highway was closed due to rock slides. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris or damage, just barriers that had not been there when she arrived. She tried the other road out of town and found it similarly blocked. She was trapped, and the realization sent waves of panic through her chest. That afternoon, while frantically searching her motel room for any option or escape route, Zoe found something hidden behind the loose baseboard under the sink. It was a notebook, small and water-damaged, filled with handwritten notes in cramped handwriting. The notebook belonged to someone named Marcus Chen, and according to the dates on the entries, he had been in Coldwater in August of 1982, investigating the same phenomenon that had brought Zoe there. Marcus had documented everything. The 3 a.m. broadcasts that occurred every single night without fail, the violations and disappearances of people who did not follow instructions, his own growing fear and paranoia as he realized he could not leave. The final entry was dated August 28, 1982, and it read, "I understand now. The broadcasts are not random. They are training. The town is preparing for something, has been preparing for decades. I have been noticed. Tomorrow, I will try to escape during daylight hours before the barriers go up. If you find this, do not make the same mistakes I made. Leave before you understand. The entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if Marcus had been interrupted or had run out of time. Following Marcus's advice, Zoe packed only her most essential belongings and left the motel at noon, driving toward the roadblocks as if she intended to turn around, but then veering off onto a Forest Service road that she had noticed during her explorations. The dirt road was rough and barely maintained, but it headed in the general direction of the county highway, and it was her only option. She drove for 45 minutes through dense forest, her car bouncing over ruts and rocks, until she finally emerged onto a paved road that she recognized as being outside Coldwater's immediate area. She did not stop driving until she reached Missoula 4 hours later, and even then she felt the urge to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the town that had held her captive. Zoe returned to Coldwater 3 weeks later with state police and officials from the county sheriff's department, determined to expose what was happening there and to find answers about Marcus Chen and the person who had disappeared from Unit 6. But when they arrived at the coordinates where Coldwater should have been, they found nothing. There was a clearing in the forest where a town might once have stood, but there were no buildings, no roads, no infrastructure, no evidence that anyone had lived there in decades. The police checked their maps and their GPS systems and confirmed that they were at the correct location, but Coldwater simply did not exist. Zoe's photographs from her time in the town were corrupted, every image replaced by static or darkness. Her audio recordings were erased. The only physical evidence that survived was Marcus Chen's notebook, which she had kept in her possession the entire time. The authorities filed a report noting the discrepancy, but took no further action. As far as they were concerned, Zoe had experienced some kind of stress-related episode or had been the victim of an elaborate hoax, though they could not explain who would create such a hoax or why. Zoe's editor ran a shortened version of her story, but it was treated as an unsolved mystery rather than as investigative journalism, and most readers dismissed it as creative fiction. Zoe tried to move on, tried to focus on other stories and other investigations, but Coldwater haunted her in ways that went beyond simple trauma or fear. Every month since her escape, Zoe received an envelope in the mail with no return address and a postmark from a different location each time. Inside each envelope was a single photograph showing the clearing where Coldwater had been. But in each photograph, there was one new person standing in the center of the frame. The person was always different. A young woman in hiking gear, an older man in business clothes, a teenager with a backpack, people who looked like travelers or tourists or researchers. None of them ever looked directly at the camera. They all stood with their backs turned, facing toward the tree line, as if waiting for permission to enter something that Zoe could not see. She kept all the photographs in a locked box, documenting them and trying to identify the people, but she never found any answers. The photographs suggested that Coldwater was still operating, still claiming new residents or victims, still existing in a space that defied conventional geography and rational explanation. And Zoe knew that somewhere in Montana there was a town that appeared and disappeared according to rules she would never understand. A place where emergency broadcasts trained people for purposes that remained hidden, and where anyone who broke the pattern simply ceased to exist.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the most remote and unforgiving corners of the Appalachian Mountains where civilization fades and something far more primitive takes hold. In this episode, we will uncover 8 deeply disturbing encounters with feral human beings who have abandoned society and embraced a savage existence in the ancient wilderness. These are not legends or folklore, but documented testimonies from geologists, park rangers, hunters, and researchers who stumbled upon communities of people living in ways that defy modern understanding. Each account has been meticulously verified through cross-referenced reports, physical evidence, and witness testimonies that paint a horrifying picture of human devolution in America's last wild places. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered, but the core experiences remain untouched in all their terrifying authenticity. These survivors have chosen to share their stories as warnings to others who might venture too deep into the mountains where humanity ends and something else begins. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the files that others tried to bury. Now let us begin our descent into the heart of Appalachian darkness. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been a park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 11 years. In that time, I have seen my fair share of dangerous wildlife, lost hikers, and emergency rescues. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the 3rd week of September 2022. What I am about to tell you goes against every official report I filed, every statement I gave to my supervisors, and every rational explanation I once believed about what lives in these ancient mountains. It started with the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in 4 days, all along the same general area near Cataract Falls, about 7 miles into the backcountry. The first was Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old from Nashville who had been backpacking solo. Her tent was found intact, sleeping bag still rolled out, but her hiking boots were missing and her food cache had been completely emptied. Not by bears, though. Bears leave distinct claw marks and tear packaging apart. This was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The second disappearance was more troubling. 2 college students from Georgia, Tyler and Amanda, had been camping together near the old logging road that cuts through Pine Creek Ridge. Their campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of dinner. Canned beans still warm in the pot, flashlights still on, but both their packs were gone and their hiking poles had been snapped in half and arranged in a peculiar pattern around their extinguished fire. The pattern looked almost ritualistic, like some kind of warning or territorial marker. By the time we found the 3rd site, I knew we were dealing with something beyond standard search and rescue protocols. An experienced outdoorsman named Frank Costello had been hiking the same trail system for 20 years. He knew these mountains better than most of the seasonal rangers. His campsite was completely destroyed, not damaged, but systematically dismantled. Every piece of equipment had been taken apart, sorted, and arranged in neat piles based on material. Metal items in one stack, synthetic fabrics in another, food containers in a third. It was the work of intelligence, not animal instinct. My supervisor assigned me to lead a 3-day search operation with 2 other rangers, hoping to find some trace of the missing hikers before the weather turned. We packed enough supplies for 5 days just in case, and set out before dawn on Thursday morning. The plan was to follow the main trail system, then branch out into the more remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. The first day yielded nothing unusual. We found the abandoned campsites I had already documented, took additional photographs, and searched the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or direction of travel. The forest felt different than usual, though. Too quiet. In 11 years of working these trails, I had never hiked for hours without hearing the standard sounds of wildlife. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. That evening, we made camp at a designated backcountry site about 4 miles from the last known location of Frank Costello. As we prepared dinner, Ranger Phillips mentioned something that had been bothering him all day. He had been finding tracks, but they did not match any known wildlife in the area. They were roughly human-sized, but the gait pattern was wrong. Too long between steps, and the impression showed toes that were unusually spread, like someone who had never worn shoes. Around midnight, we heard the first call. It started as what sounded like a woman crying for help, echoing from somewhere deep in the valley below our campsite. We immediately grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound, following standard rescue protocols. But as we got closer, the voice changed. It became deeper, more guttural, and the words became less distinct. By the time we reached the area where the sound had originated, there was only silence. That was when Phillips found the first trail marker. Not an official Park Service marker, but something else entirely. A deer skull mounted on a broken tree branch, positioned at eye level and facing directly back toward our campsite. The bone had been stripped completely clean, but there were tool marks on it. Deliberate scraping and cutting that suggested the use of crude but effective implements. We followed a series of these markers for over a mile, each one more elaborate than the last. Animal bones arranged in specific patterns, strips of fabric that clearly came from hiking gear, and eventually pieces of human clothing hung from branches like primitive flags. The trail led us deeper into terrain that was not marked on any of our maps, through dense undergrowth that showed clear signs of regular travel. The path ended at a clearing that should not have existed. In the center was what I can only describe as a processing site. Large, flat rocks arranged in a circle, stained dark with what was unmistakably blood. Animal hides stretched between wooden frames made from saplings. Piles of bones sorted by type and size, and hanging from a makeshift rack constructed of branches and rope, strips of meat in various stages of drying. But it was the smell that confirmed our worst fears. Not just the metallic scent of blood or the gamey odor of wild meat. There was something else underneath it all, something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. I had smelled it once before, during a recovery operation where we found a hiker who had been dead for over a week. Human decomposition has a distinct odor that you never forget. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Phillips grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in our flashlight beams. They were human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Gaunt and pale, with long matted hair and movements that were too fluid, too predatory. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, and they carried crude weapons made from sharpened sticks and metal scavenged from camping gear. The largest of the 3 stepped forward and made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization. It was clearly some form of communication, but unlike any language I had ever heard. The other 2 responded in kind, and they began to circle our position with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. We backed toward the trail we had followed into the clearing, but one of the creatures moved to block our path. Up close, I could see that it had once been human, but years of living wild had changed it in fundamental ways. Its teeth were filed to points, its fingernails grown long and sharp, and its skin was covered in scars and primitive tattoos made from ash and blood. The standoff lasted only seconds before training took over. We fired our service weapons into the air, hoping to scare them off without causing injury. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creatures immediately scattered, disappearing into the underbrush with inhuman speed and silence. We ran, For over 2 miles, we ran through terrain that seemed designed to slow us down and separate us. Fallen logs blocked our path at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or go around. Low-hanging branches created natural barriers that had to be navigated carefully in the dark. And all around us, we could hear them moving through the forest, staying parallel to our position but never quite visible. By the time we reached our original campsite, dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. We packed our gear in record time and hiked directly back to the ranger station, where I immediately contacted my supervisor and the county sheriff. The official report documented our discovery of what we termed an illegal hunting camp and possible poaching operation. No mention was made of the creatures we encountered or the clear evidence of human predation we had witnessed. 2 weeks later, a joint operation between Park Service personnel and federal agents returned to the site. They found nothing. The clearing had been abandoned, all evidence removed, and the trail markers had been taken down. According to the official summary, we had likely encountered a group of individuals living illegally within park boundaries who had fled when discovered. But I know what I saw, and 6 months later, when the disappearances started again, this time near Cades Cove, I was not surprised. I requested a transfer to a different park and was granted approval within 30 days. My replacement, a young ranger named Matthews, lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting his own transfer. He never told me what he encountered, but I recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted expression I see in my own reflection every morning. The official position of the National Park Service is that no feral human populations exist within protected boundaries. But late at night, when I am alone with my thoughts, I remember the intelligence behind those pale eyes and the calculated way they moved through their territory. Whatever they once were, they had adapted to life in the deep wilderness in ways that made them more dangerous than any natural predator. I still work as a park ranger, but now in Colorado, where the mountains are younger and the forests hold different secrets. Sometimes, though, I get calls from colleagues still working in the Smokies. They tell me about hikers who vanish without explanation, about campsites found empty with all the food missing, about sounds in the night that do not match any known wildlife. And I tell them what my supervisor told me after I filed my original report. Some things are better left unreported, and some trails are better left unfollowed. The Smoky Mountains have been home to humans for thousands of years, but not all of them chose to remain part of civilization. My name is Marcus Thompson, and if you are listening to this, let me say one thing up front. I am not a storyteller. I am a geologist. That means I spend my days squinting at rocky outcrops, taking core samples and running numbers on mineral content, not spinning ghost stories around the campfire. But every so often, the world reminds you that numbers cannot explain everything. Some things belong to the wilderness, and the Appalachians, ancient, lonely, and largely untamed, hide things no field manual will tell you about. It was a late October morning in 2023 when I hiked up into the Blue Ridge on assignment. My company had been contracted to survey an area for a possible pipeline expansion, and my section included a stretch of remote, rocky terrain near the Carolina border. The locals in the neighboring town of Elmswood said little about the area except that it was best left undisturbed. Some joked about mountain lions, others about something older. I tuned it all out. I had data to collect. The first thing you have to understand about this place is the silence. I do not mean the quiet of a city park or even the hush after fresh snowfall. I mean the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you aware of your own breathing. The wind in these mountains moves in odd currents. Sometimes a gentle sigh, sometimes a cold hand up the back of your neck. The trees here grow thick and close, their roots so tangled in the old rock that when you try to cut a trail, you end up walking in circles. That morning, the autumn leaves had already fallen in great rust red and gold mats, muffling even my own footsteps. The initial part of my hike was routine. I checked coordinates, marked outcrops, and documented a few minor landslides. About 3 miles from the main road, past an abandoned fire tower, the ground pitched downward without warning. The soil here breaks into shelves, scarred by centuries of frost and flood. My boots crunched over broken stones peppered with white bleached animal bones, deer, rabbit, raccoon, and things I could not immediately name. Then I found the entrance. It was almost by accident. The map in my hand showed a cluster of limestone shortcuts, but it did not mark this. A slit in the hill about 5 feet high and 3 feet across, half concealed by blackberry thicket and loose scree. At first I thought it was just a failed fox den, but something about the geometry, deliberate, almost architectural, caught my attention. I set down my pack, flicked on my headlamp, and squeezed inside. Inside, the cave air was heavy, the temperature instantly dropping several degrees. The beam of my flashlight swept over rock walls mottled with veins of white and rusty orange calcite. About 20 feet in, the passage widened unexpectedly. A natural chamber maybe 15 feet across, domed overhead. Something scuttled in the darkness. I froze, breath clouding in the sudden chill. That was when I noticed 2 things at once. First, the scent. It was not an animal smell per se. It was wet earth, sweat, something raw and unnatural like rust and wild onions. Second, the marks. At first I thought they were petroglyphs, marks left by ancient hands, their precise meaning lost to time. But the patterns were crude, yet fresh. Long parallel scratches, shallow at either end, scored deeply into the limestone at odd intervals. There were also smudges, ashy, greasy fingerprints, and 4 old, blood-darkened handprints spidered across the wall above a nest of moss and animal pelts. I felt real unease for the first time. Years of fieldwork have taught me what is and is not a bear, a wildcat, or a trespassing scavenger. But nothing I knew lined up with what I saw here. The nest, if you could call it that, was ringed not only with tufts of dry grass and leaves, but with carefully arranged bones, most of them animal, but some plainly horrifyingly human. Fingers, a jawbone, what looked like several molars embedded in a chunk of weathered gum. My rational mind insisted I was witnessing the detritus of some deranged squatter. Maybe a small-time cult or someone hiding from the world and sinking into madness. But then I heard the breathing. It came from deeper in the cave, a slow, laboring draw of air, so faint I almost missed it. My muscles locked, time stretched out. Then deliberately I stepped back, headlamp swinging, heart kicking a painful rhythm in my chest. That was when the thing moved. The barest shuffle, then a soft grunt, not animal, not quite human. My beam caught on an eye, not the red shine of a deer nor the pale flicker of a raccoon. This was a wet, milky orb, blinkless, socketed in a gaunt, angular face streaked with dirt and tangled black hair. Its lips thinned over oversized teeth, fragments of something soft and pink hanging from its mouth. I stifled a gasp. My mind, despite everything, tried to negotiate. This was a person, after all. A desperate, starved hermit. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there? Do you need help?" My words barely echoed, dissolving in the humid dark. The being clicked its tongue rapidly, a staccato rhythm echoing against stone, its nostrils widening as if to scent me. It ducked low, frog-like, impossibly fast, hands touching the dirt as if ready to launch forward. I retreated several steps, pulse hammering in my ears. I remembered what my local contact, Joe, 60-something, lived his whole life in Elmswood, told me before I left, "If you hear whistling or see shapes watching you from the tree line, do not linger, do not stare, do not try to help." I flicked my headlamp off for an instant, willing my body to quiet. When I turned it back on, the thing had crept closer, almost at the edge of the light. I could make out a twisted, splayed body, long limbs, muddy fingers, ribs showing through smudged skin. No clothes except a ragged sheet or pelt knotted at the waist. It crawled like a spider. Suddenly it screamed. The sound was nothing like a human. It started deep in the chest, then rose, ululating, hitting an octave that sent birds fleeing from trees outside. My ears rang. Instinct took over and I ran. I stumbled, lost my balance, bashed my shoulder bloody against a stone outcropping, but somehow clawed my way into the open air. Adrenaline made everything vivid, the shock of sunlight, the hiss of wind in brittle grass, the taste of bile in my throat. As I staggered back onto the trail, I heard something shuffle behind me, then impossibly a faint, mocking whistle. The same pattern I had tapped on rock as a child when I was scared of the dark. The thing was mimicking me. I ran until my legs gave out. Every bush and shadow seemed to breathe, and I found myself constantly glancing back, half convinced I was being followed. I reached half a mile down the trail before collapsing in the dry leaves. Only then, shaking, did I check my phone. No bars, no GPS signal. I forced myself to keep moving, panic rising afresh with every imagined footfall, every twig snap. Eventually, numb with fatigue, I reached my car as late afternoon light poured sideways across the mountain. I fumbled my keys, hands shaking, and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a flicker at the edge of the woods. The shadow of something long-limbed just out of sight. I never went back. The next day, the company called. The survey was canceled. Nothing further needed at my site. I told them someone was living in that cave, that it was not safe. The words felt weak, like something I should have forgotten after a sleepless night, but they have not left me. Weeks passed and I tried to forget, to rationalize. But every now and then I would get a text or call from colleagues assigned further down the escarpment. Small things at first. Missing equipment, butchered kits, GPS units ruined or stolen, weird scratches found on vehicles. Months later, Joe called me, voice hollow. "Listen, Marcus," he whispered. "They found another cave. This time there were boot prints. Not just animal ones, but both. Big, human. But the rangers said they ended halfway up a cliff wall, like whoever made them walked into thin air." "What about the person?" He paused so long I thought the line had dropped. "Wasn't just one," he finally said. "There's more than one thing living up there. And the oldest folks say some of them have been there longer than the towns. Longer than people I hung up, cold and sweating." I moved back north a few months later and changed my cell number. But sometimes, especially on autumn nights just before dark, when the wind howls through narrow valleys, I smell that mix of wet earth, sweat, and old wild onions. And I remember the watcher in the cave, waiting for darkness to fall again. If there is a lesson, it is this. Do not go inviting explanations for the unnatural. Sometimes the things that stare from the dark are not waiting to be found, and if you do find them, they will remember your face. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and I spent 3 summers working as an outdoor education counselor for Camp Wildwood, a residential program that brought inner-city kids from Baltimore and Philadelphia into the West Virginia mountains for 2 weeks of wilderness experience. I loved that job. There is something magical about watching a teenager who has never seen stars without light pollution look up at the Milky Way for the first time, or helping a kid who grew up in concrete and asphalt learn to identify bird calls and animal tracks. The summer of 2021 was my 3rd year with the program, and I had been promoted to senior counselor, which meant I was responsible for the overnight backpacking trips with our older campers. These were 14 and 15-year-olds who had demonstrated responsibility and wilderness skills during their first week at base camp. The backpacking experience was meant to be the highlight of their stay, 3 days and 2 nights in the deep forest of Monongahela, sleeping under canvas and learning advanced survival techniques. Our group that July consisted of 8 kids and 3 counselors, including myself. The other 2 counselors were Marcus, a 24-year-old forestry student from West Virginia University, and Sarah, a 23-year-old from Pittsburgh who had been working wilderness programs for 4 years. We had been planning this particular route for months, a challenging but manageable loop trail that would take us through some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the forest. The first day went perfectly. We hiked 6 miles through mixed hardwood forest, crossed 3 streams, and made camp in a designated backcountry site near Otter Creek. The kids were excited and engaged, asking good questions about plant identification and animal behavior. After dinner, we sat around our carefully contained campfire, and I taught them some of the Cherokee legends about the mountains while Sarah helped them identify constellations. It was around 10:30 that night when we first heard the other children laughing. At first, none of us thought much of it. Summer camps use the Monongahela system regularly, and while our site was supposed to be isolated, it was possible another group was camping within a mile or 2 of our location. The laughter was distant but clear, the unmistakable sound of kids playing some kind of game in the dark. High-pitched giggles and what sounded like a group of voices calling out to each other. One of our campers, a 14-year-old named Damon from West Philadelphia, sat up in his sleeping bag and listened intently. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, "that sounds like kids our age. Can we go say hi?" I explained that wandering around in the forest at night was against safety protocols, but promised we would keep an ear out and maybe try to make contact in the morning if the other group was still in the area. The voices continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always just at the edge of our hearing. What struck me as odd was the consistency of the laughter. In my experience working with teenagers, group play usually involves periods of quiet planning, arguments about rules, or natural breaks in activity. But these voices maintained the same level of excited chatter without any variation in tone or intensity. Around midnight, the sound stopped completely and we all settled in for sleep. I was sharing a tent with 2 of the girls, and Marcus and Sarah each had tents with groups of the boys. As the senior counselor, I always stayed awake longer than the others, making sure everyone was settled and listening for any sounds that might indicate wildlife in the area. I must have dozed off around 1 in the morning because the next thing I remember was being woken by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Isabella," she whispered urgently, "you need to hear this." I checked my watch. It was 3:15. Outside our tent, I could hear voices again, but they were much closer this time. Close enough that I could make out individual words. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were calling out names, but they were the names of our campers. "Damon," called a young voice that sounded exactly like one of our girls. "Damon, come play with us." Then another voice, this one sounding like Marcus. "Isabella, we found something cool. Come see." But Marcus was in his tent and I could hear him breathing deeply in sleep. And the girl whose voice had called for Damon was in the tent right next to mine, also clearly asleep. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They have been doing this for 10 minutes, she whispered, using our voices, calling our names. But everyone is accounted for. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the darkness. Our campfire had died down to glowing embers, but there was enough moonlight to see the immediate area around our tents. Nothing moved, but the voices continued, now coming from multiple directions around our campsite. A perfect imitation of my own voice called out, "Marcus, can you help me with something?" Then what sounded exactly like Sarah, "Kids, wake up." We are going to see something amazing. The mimicry was flawless. Not just the tone and pitch, but speech patterns and phrases that each of us actually used. Whoever or whatever was out there had been listening to us carefully enough to reproduce our individual ways of speaking with perfect accuracy. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of investigating or trying to make contact, I woke everyone up as quietly as possible and told them we were breaking camp immediately. Some of the kids complained, thinking it was some kind of drill or test, but the fear in my voice must have convinced them this was serious. We packed our gear by flashlight in complete silence, and within 30 minutes we were hiking back toward base camp in the middle of the night. The voices followed us for the first mile, sometimes ahead of us on the trail, sometimes flanking us through the trees, always using our own voices to try to get us to respond or separate from the group. "Isabella, why are we running?" in perfect imitation of one of my campers. "Guys, wait up. I dropped something," in Sarah's exact voice, even though Sarah was right beside me. The most terrifying moment came when we reached a fork in the trail. We had taken the left path on our way in, but in the darkness and stress of the emergency evacuation, I was not entirely certain which way led back to camp. As I stood there with my map and compass trying to get our bearings, I heard my own voice calling from the right-hand path. "This way, everyone." I found the trail, but I was standing right there and I had not said a word. That was when 8-year-old Keisha, one of our younger campers who had been moved up to the advanced group because of her exceptional wilderness skills, tugged on my sleeve and whispered something that still gives me nightmares. "Miss Isabella," she said, "I can see them in the trees. They look like kids, but they are moving wrong." I followed her gaze and saw shapes moving through the forest canopy, traveling from branch to branch with fluid grace that no human child could possess. They were roughly the right size and shape to be teenagers, but they moved like primates, swinging and leaping between trees with casual ease. And they were naked, their pale skin almost luminous in the moonlight. We took the left path and kept moving, but the pursuit continued for another 2 miles. The voices became more desperate and commanding, perfect imitations of our own voices ordering us to stop, to come back, to split up so they could help us better. They knew our names, our mannerisms, even private conversations we had had earlier in the day. Around 5 in the morning, as dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, the voices finally stopped. We reached base camp exhausted and shaken, but alive and all accounted for. The camp director, a man named Robert who had been running wilderness programs for 15 years, listened to our report with growing concern. After we had all eaten breakfast and the kids were resting in their cabins, he pulled the 3 counselors aside for a private conversation. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," he told us. "We have had reports of voices in the forest, mimicry, and sightings of what people describe as feral children for the past 3 years. Always in the same general area where you were camping." He showed us a file that contained incident reports from other camps and individual hikers, all describing similar encounters with beings that appeared to be human children but displayed impossible physical abilities and predatory behavior. According to Robert, the local rangers were aware of the situation but had no effective way to address it. The creatures, whatever they were, showed clear intelligence and seemed to understand that they were being hunted. They avoided all attempts at contact or capture, and they never left physical evidence that could be documented or studied. The most disturbing part of Robert's briefing was his theory about what we were dealing with. He believed these were children who had become lost in the forest over the years and had somehow survived by adapting to a completely wild existence. Cut off from human society during critical developmental years, they had reverted to primitive behaviors while retaining enough human intelligence to be incredibly dangerous. The mimicry suggests they understand that human communication is important, he explained, but they use it as a hunting tool. the way some predators use camouflage or deception to catch prey. They have learned that humans respond to familiar voices, especially the voices of people they trust. We never went back to that area of the forest. The camp program was moved to a different section of Monongahela the following summer, and new safety protocols were established requiring all overnight trips to carry satellite communication devices and travel in larger groups. But I sometimes wonder about those children, if that is what they were. How long had they been living wild in those mountains? How many were there? And what had happened to turn them from lost children into something that hunted other humans? 6 months after our encounter, Robert called to tell me that 2 hikers had gone missing in the same area where we had been camping. Their backpacks were found hanging from tree branches 30 feet off the ground, but there was no sign of the hikers themselves. The local search and rescue team found tracks around the area, small human footprints that led into the forest canopy and disappeared. I still work with kids, but now in urban educational programs where the biggest danger is traffic and the most exotic wildlife is pigeons. Sometimes, though, when I hear children laughing and playing outside my apartment window, I find myself listening carefully to make sure the voices belong to children I can actually see. Because I learned that summer that not everything that sounds human actually is, and some of the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly how to sound like someone you trust. The Monongahela National Forest covers over 900,000 acres of wilderness. That is a lot of space for things to hide, and a lot of places where lost children might learn to survive in ways that change them into something else entirely. Something that remembers just enough about being human to be more dangerous than any natural predator. My name is Jackson O'Brien, and I have been bow hunting in the Pennsylvania mountains for 15 years. I grew up in Scranton, but every November since I turned 16, I have made the trip up to the Allegheny National Forest with my father and uncle for our annual deer hunt. It was a tradition that meant everything to me. 3 generations of O'Brien men carrying on something that had started with my great-grandfather, who immigrated from County Cork in 1923. The autumn of 2020 was different because it was the first year I went without my father. He had passed away from cancer that spring, and my Uncle Pat decided he was too old to make the trip anymore. But I could not break the tradition. I convinced my 2 best friends, Derek and Tommy, to join me for what I promised would be a straightforward hunting trip in an area I knew better than my own neighborhood. We arrived at our usual campsite on Sunday afternoon, the 2nd week of November. The location was perfect for deer hunting, a small clearing surrounded by oak and maple trees about 8 miles into the forest, accessible only by an old logging road that required 4-wheel drive to navigate. We had been camping there for years, and I could set up our base camp with my eyes closed. Derek was 29, a construction foreman from Philadelphia who had grown up hunting with his grandfather. Tommy was 31 like me, an Iraq veteran who worked as a mechanic and used hunting as a way to deal with what he called his demons from overseas. Both were experienced outdoorsmen who knew how to move quietly through the forest and respect the wilderness we were entering. The first sign that something was different came Monday morning. We split up before dawn to cover more ground, each taking a different section of the ridge system we had mapped out over years of hunting the area. The plan was to meet back at camp by noon to compare notes and plan the afternoon hunt. I was about 2 miles north of our campsite, sitting in a tree stand I had used many times before, when I noticed the complete absence of wildlife. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, I had never experienced such absolute silence. No bird calls, no squirrels moving through the trees, not even the sound of insects. It was like every living thing had decided to leave the area overnight. Around 10 in the morning, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the forest about 100 yards to my east, staying just at the edge of my sight. At first, I assumed it was Derek or Tommy, maybe tracking a wounded deer or exploring new territory. But the movement pattern was wrong. Too fluid, too quiet, and following no logical hunting strategy I could recognize. I climbed down from my stand and tried to get a better look, but whatever it was stayed just out of clear view. I could catch glimpses through the trees, a dark shape that seemed to be paralleling my position but maintaining its distance. When I moved toward it, it moved away. When I stopped, it stopped. It was like being shadowed by something that understood exactly what I was doing and why. By noon, neither Derek nor Tommy had returned to camp. I waited until 2 in the afternoon, then began following the trails we had agreed they would take. Derek's path led along a creek bed where the hunting was usually excellent, but I found no trace of him beyond his initial tracks leaving camp. Tommy's route took him up to a rocky outcropping that provided a good view of the entire valley, but when I reached the spot, there was no sign he had ever been there. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling their names and firing signal shots with my rifle, standard protocol when someone gets lost or separated. The sound echoed through the mountains, but there was no response. As darkness fell, I returned to camp and built up the fire, hoping they would see the light and find their way back. That was when I heard the first response to my calls. It came from the direction Derek had taken that morning. A perfect imitation of Tommy's voice calling my name. "Jackson," it called. "Stay over here." I found something, but Tommy had gone in the opposite direction and the voice was coming from an area I had already searched thoroughly. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and headed toward the sound, but as I got closer, the voice moved farther away. It kept calling, sometimes using Derek's voice, sometimes Tommy's, always staying just out of sight and leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. After 20 minutes of following the voices through dense underbrush, I realized what was happening and stopped dead in my tracks. Something was using my friends' voices to lure me away from camp, and that meant either they were being controlled somehow or something else had learned to mimic their speech perfectly. Either possibility terrified me. I made it back to camp and spent the night awake by the fire, rifle across my knees, listening to the voices of my friends calling to me from multiple directions around the perimeter of the clearing. Sometimes they sounded injured, begging for help. Sometimes they sounded excited, claiming to have made a big kill and needing assistance. The mimicry was flawless, including inside jokes and personal references that only Derek and Tommy would know. Tuesday morning, I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to search for my friends, I broke camp and hiked directly back to where we had parked the truck. The entire 8-mile hike, I was followed by voices in the forest, becoming increasingly desperate and angry as they realized I was leaving. When I reached the truck, I found Derek's bow and arrow quiver hanging from the side mirror. They had not been there when we arrived Sunday, and they showed clear signs of being deliberately placed as some kind of message or trophy. The arrows had been removed, and the bowstring had been cut, making the weapon useless. I drove directly to the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks and reported my friends missing. The search and rescue operation began that afternoon and continued for 5 days. They found Tommy's backpack hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, but there was no indication of how it had gotten there or why someone would have placed it at that height. Derek's rifle was discovered 3 days later, partially buried under a pile of stones arranged in a careful pattern. The weapon had been completely disassembled, every piece separated and cleaned, then reassembled incorrectly so that it could not function. It was the work of intelligence, not animals or natural processes. The official search was called off after a week with no trace of either man beyond the abandoned equipment. The conclusion was that they had become lost or injured and succumbed to exposure, though their bodies were never recovered despite extensive efforts involving helicopters and teams of volunteers. But I knew what had really happened, and 6 months later I got confirmation. I was contacted by a park ranger named Williams, who worked in a different section of the Allegheny National Forest. She told me that hunting parties had been reporting similar experiences for the past 2 years. Voices calling from the forest using the names and speech patterns of missing members. Equipment found arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence and planning. According to Ranger Williams, there was an unofficial theory among some of the Park Service personnel that a group of people had been living deep in the forest for years, possibly generations. They had developed hunting skills that surpassed anything modern outdoorsmen possessed, and they viewed the forest as their exclusive territory. The theory suggested that these people had learned to mimic human speech as a hunting technique, the same way some predatory animals use camouflage or deception. They would isolate individual members of hunting parties, then use their voices to lure others into situations where they could be captured or killed. She also told me that the Pennsylvania Game Commission had documented a significant decline in deer populations throughout the region over the past 5 years, despite reduced hunting pressure and ideal breeding conditions. Something was hunting the deer with efficiency that exceeded both natural predation and legal hunting combined. I never went back to the Allegheny Mountains. The following year, I started hunting in New York State, always in groups of at least 4 people, and never in areas more than 3 miles from a main road. But sometimes when I am sitting in a tree stand waiting for deer, I hear voices calling from deeper in the forest. And sometimes those voices sound exactly like Derek and Tommy, still trying to get me to follow them into the darkness. Tommy's wife received his military death benefits after the official declaration, but Derek's family never got closure. His parents still believe he might be alive somewhere, maybe injured and unable to find his way home. I have never told them about the voices that used his speech patterns or about the bow hanging from our truck like a warning sign. The Allegheny Mountains have been home to hunters for thousands of years, long before Europeans arrived with modern weapons and hunting regulations. Some of those hunters never stopped viewing the forest as their territory, and they have developed skills that make modern outdoorsmen look like amateurs playing games in their backyard. They are still there, watching and waiting for the next group that ventures too deep into their domain. And they have learned that the most effective way to hunt humans is to use the voices of people we trust, calling to us from the darkness until we follow them far enough from safety that no one will ever find us again. My name is Ezra Mitchell, and for 7 years I lived completely off the grid in the remote foothills of eastern Kentucky. I moved there in 2015 after a messy divorce cost me my house in Louisville and left me questioning everything about modern life. I bought 43 acres of mountainous woodland for less than what most people pay for a car, built a small cabin with my own hands, and learned to live the way my great-grandfather had lived before electricity, and running water changed everything. The property was beautiful in its isolation. Dense mixed forest of oak, maple, and pine stretched in every direction, broken only by a clear creek that ran through the lower section and provided fresh water year-round. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away through difficult terrain, and the closest road that could handle a regular vehicle was a 2-mile hike down a steep trail I had cut myself. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been seeking. A place where a man could live according to his own rules and never have to deal with the complications of modern society. I had been there about 18 months when I first noticed signs that someone else was using my property. It started small. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek that were not made by my boots. Stones that had been moved from their natural positions to create what looked like primitive markers or trail signs. Areas where someone had clearly been digging, though for what purpose I could not determine. At first, I assumed it was someone passing through, maybe hunting illegally or using my land as a shortcut to somewhere else. These mountains had been home to people for centuries before property lines and deeds divided everything up, and I figured I was probably not the first person to think this particular piece of wilderness would make a good place to live. But the signs became more frequent and more deliberate. Someone was harvesting wild edibles from areas I had been managing myself, taking specific plants in a pattern that showed knowledge of sustainable gathering practices. My fish traps in the creek were being checked and sometimes emptied, but whoever was doing it knew enough to reset them properly afterward. Most disturbing of all, I started finding evidence that someone had been watching my cabin from various positions in the surrounding forest. One morning in late September, I discovered fresh footprints in the soft earth near my garden that led directly to my root cellar. I had built the cellar into the hillside behind my cabin using traditional methods I had learned from books about Appalachian homesteading. It was basically a cave lined with stone walls and wooden shelving designed to keep vegetables and preserved food at a constant cool temperature through the winter months. The footprints were human but wrong somehow. Too narrow for their length, with the toes spread wider than normal like someone who had never worn shoes. They circled the cellar entrance multiple times, and whoever had made them had spent considerable time examining the wooden door I had built to seal the entrance. That evening, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the loft of my cabin with a clear view of the root cellar and settled in for what I figured might be a long night. I had my hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee prepared to wait until dawn if necessary. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement near the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest and approached the root cellar with the careful movements of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the moonlight, I could see it was human-shaped but moved wrong, staying low to the ground and using both hands and feet to navigate the terrain. The figure spent nearly an hour examining my root cellar, running its hands over the door and walls, even pressing its face against the wood as if trying to smell what was inside. Finally, it began to dig. Not at the door, but next to the cellar, scraping at the earth with its bare hands and what looked like crude tools made from sharpened sticks and stones. I watched in growing alarm as it became clear that whoever this was intended to dig their way into my food storage. This was not casual trespassing or harmless curiosity. This was someone who knew I had food stored there and was methodically planning to take it. I made a decision that I have regretted ever since. Instead of confronting the intruder immediately, I decided to wait and see how far they would go. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth is I was afraid. Something about the figure's movements and the deliberate way it worked suggested this was not some random vagrant or desperate local resident. This was something else entirely. The digging continued for 3 nights. Each time the figure would emerge from the forest around the same time, work for several hours, then disappear before dawn. It was making steady progress, tunneling along the stone wall of the cellar toward what I knew was the corner where I kept my winter supply of potatoes and preserved meat. On the 4th night, I decided to move my observation post closer. I climbed down from the cabin loft and positioned myself behind a large oak tree about 50 feet from the cellar. From there, I had a much clearer view of what was happening, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was not alone. There were 3 of them, all working together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. They had tools, crude but effective implements made from metal scavenged from old farm equipment and sharpened stones, and they were not just digging randomly. They had a plan, a systematic approach to reaching my stored food that showed intelligence and long-term thinking. But it was their appearance that truly frightened me. These were human beings, but they had been changed by years of living completely wild. Their skin was darkened by dirt and weather, their hair grown long and matted with debris. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, animal hides mixed with fragments of modern fabric that had probably been scavenged from abandoned campsites or hunting cabins. Most disturbing of all was the way they communicated. They made soft grunting and clicking sounds, a primitive language that seemed to convey complex information with remarkable efficiency. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly accustomed to working as a team. By the fifth night, they had broken through into my root cellar. I watched from my hiding place as they systematically emptied my winter food supply, passing containers and bundles of preserved meat from hand to hand in a human chain that disappeared into the forest. They took everything. Months of preparation for winter gone in a single night. But they left something behind. In the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to inspect the damage, I found that they had arranged some of their own food stores in place of what they had taken. Wild tubers, nuts, dried meat that smelled wrong, and other foraged items I could not identify. It was not an equal trade by any means, but it was clearly intentional. They were not thieves in the traditional sense. They were operating according to some kind of primitive social code that I did not understand. That was when I found the bones. Hidden in the back corner of the root cellar, carefully wrapped in what looked like human hair woven into crude rope, was a collection of bones that made me physically sick. Most were animal, but some were unmistakably human. Finger bones, teeth, what looked like pieces of a human skull. And they were old, weathered smooth by years of handling. I left that same day. I packed only what I could carry in my truck and abandoned 7 years of work building a life in those mountains. I never went back, never tried to sell the property, never even contacted the local authorities. I told myself that no one would believe me, but the truth is I was terrified of what might happen if I brought outside attention to whatever was living in those hills. 6 months later, I heard from a friend in Louisville who had seen a news report about the area. A hunting party had found what authorities described as an illegal campsite on the same mountain where my property was located. The report mentioned evidence of long-term habitation, primitive shelters, and what investigators called disturbing artifacts that suggested the site had been occupied for years. The hunters who made the discovery refused to go into detail about what they had seen, but one of them was quoted as saying that whoever had been living there was not living by any rules that civilized people would recognize. The investigation was turned over to federal authorities, and as far as I know, no results were ever made public. I live in a suburban apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and all the complications of modern life I once tried to escape. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I remember the sound of those primitive voices communicating in the darkness, and the careful way they had arranged their offerings in place of the food they took. I think about the bones wrapped in human hair, and I wonder how many other people had tried to build lives in those remote mountains over the years. How many had encountered the same beings I met, and how many had made different choices about how to handle the situation. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived and long before property deeds and modern law divided everything up into neat parcels. Some of those people never joined the modern world, never learned to live according to civilized rules, never stopped viewing the mountains as their territory and everyone else as intruders. They are still there, living according to ancient codes and defending their territory in ways that most people would never understand. And they are patient, watching and waiting for the next person who thinks they can build a life in the deep wilderness without understanding what else calls those mountains home. My name is Autumn Hayes, and I work as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service office in Little Rock, Arkansas. My specialty is severe weather prediction and storm tracking, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations setting up monitoring equipment and collecting atmospheric data. Most of my field work is routine, but the assignment that took me into the Ozark Mountains in March of 2022 became something that no amount of scientific training could have prepared me for. I was part of a two-person team investigating an unusual weather pattern that had been developing over the Arkansas-Missouri border region. Satellite imagery showed atmospheric disturbances that did not match any known meteorological phenomena, and ground-based radar was picking up anomalies that suggested significant storm activity in areas where local weather stations were reporting clear skies. My partner was Dr. James Crawford, the atmospheric physicist from the University of Arkansas who specialized in rare weather events. We drove up into the mountains on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the forest was just beginning to show the first signs of spring. The assignment was supposed to take 3 days, setting up temporary monitoring stations and collecting baseline data to help explain the satellite anomalies. The first 2 days went smoothly. We established monitoring stations at 3 different elevations, collected soil temperature readings, and documented local topographical features that might be affecting air currents. The equipment was functioning perfectly, and we were getting consistent readings that should have helped explain the unusual satellite data. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. We woke up to weather conditions that should have been impossible given the forecast. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color that I had only seen once before, during a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anything our instruments could properly measure, and the temperature had fallen 30 degrees since midnight. Dr. Crawford checked our equipment 3 times, convinced there was a malfunction. According to every predictive model we had access to, the conditions we were experiencing could not exist in this geographic region during this time of year. The atmospheric pressure readings suggested we were in the path of a Category 3 hurricane, but we were 600 miles from the nearest ocean and 1,500 feet above sea level. Around noon, the storm hit with a ferocity that defied explanation. Winds that our anemometer measured at over 90 miles per hour before the device was destroyed by flying debris. Rain that fell so hard it was difficult to breathe if you faced into it. Lightning strikes that seemed to target metallic objects with deliberate precision, destroying 2 of our monitoring stations in the first hour. We took shelter in our research van, but it quickly became clear that the vehicle would not provide adequate protection. The storm was not moving in any predictable pattern. Instead of passing through the area like a normal weather system, it seemed to be circling our position, creating a localized vortex of destructive weather that had no basis in atmospheric science. By 3 in the afternoon, a pine tree the size of a telephone pole crashed across the road behind us, blocking our escape route. Dr. Crawford made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed a cave opening about half a mile up the mountainside and suggested we abandon the van and seek shelter there until the storm passed. We grabbed our emergency supplies and fought our way through horizontal rain and debris to reach the cave entrance. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for several people, and extended back into the mountain far enough that we could escape the noise and fury of the storm outside. But we were not alone in that cave. As we moved deeper into the darkness, our flashlights revealed clear signs of recent habitation. A fire pit with warm ashes, sleeping areas made from animal hides and moss, and crude tools fashioned from stone and scavenged metal. Most disturbing of all was the smell, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. Dr. Crawford wanted to leave immediately and find shelter elsewhere, but the storm outside had intensified to the point where venturing back into it would have been suicidal. We positioned ourselves near the cave entrance, close enough to escape quickly if necessary, but far enough inside to be protected from the weather. That was when we heard the voices. At first, they seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave system, soft murmuring that could have been wind moving through underground passages. But gradually, the sounds became more distinct, and we realized we were listening to human conversation in a language neither of us recognized. The voices grew louder and closer, and eventually we could see flickering light from deeper in the cave that suggested someone was approaching with torches or fire. Dr. Crawford and I pressed ourselves against the cave wall, hoping to remain hidden until whoever it was had passed by. What emerged from the depths of that cave still appears in my nightmares. 3 figures that had once been human but had been changed by years of living in complete isolation from civilization. They moved with the fluid grace of people who had adapted to navigating underground passages in total darkness, and their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of nocturnal animals. They wore clothing made from animal skins and plant fibers, primitive but expertly crafted. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight, but tough and scarred from years of harsh living. Most unsettling of all was their reaction to our presence. They showed no surprise at finding strangers in their cave, as if they had been expecting us. The largest of the 3, a man who might have been 50 or 70 years old, stepped forward and spoke to us in perfect English. "Storm brought you here," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Storm always brings the lost ones to us." He gestured toward the cave entrance where rain was still pounding the mountainside. "Been waiting 3 days for this one to build right." Dr. Crawford tried to explain that we were scientists conducting weather research, that we had equipment and colleagues who would be looking for us. The man listened patiently, then smiled with teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "No equipment works when the mountain calls the storm," he said. "Been calling storms for longer than your people been keeping weather records." That was when I understood that the atmospheric anomalies we had been sent to investigate were not natural phenomena. These people, whoever they were, had somehow learned to manipulate local weather patterns. The impossible storm conditions, the localized vortex, the equipment malfunctions, all of it was being controlled by human intelligence that had developed capabilities beyond anything modern science recognized. The 3 figures seemed to be debating something among themselves in their strange language, occasionally glancing at us and gesturing toward different parts of the cave. Finally, the leader turned back to us and made an offer that chilled me to the bone. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "You can leave then. Go back to your flatland people and your machines that measure what they cannot understand. Or you can stay, learn the old ways, become part of the mountain family that keeps the ancient knowledge alive." When we indicated that we wanted to leave, his expression darkened. "Mountain does not like to let go of those who have seen too much," he warned. "Your weather machines will never work right again. Your predictions will fail when the mountain decides to call storms, and someday when you least expect it, another storm will bring you back to us." We spent that night huddled near the cave entrance, listening to the voices of the cave dwellers echoing from deep underground and watching the impossible storm continue to rage outside. By morning, the weather had cleared completely, revealing a landscape that looked like it had been hit by a tornado despite the complete absence of any rotating wind patterns. Our research van was destroyed, crushed by falling trees and battered by hailstones the size of golf balls. Most of our equipment was either missing or damaged beyond repair. We hiked back to the main road and were picked up by a search and rescue team that had been looking for us since we failed to check in the previous evening. The official report documented equipment failure due to unexpected severe weather, with no mention of the cave dwellers or their claims about controlling storms. Dr. Crawford requested a transfer to a different research program within 6 months and now works exclusively with computer models and satellite data. He has never returned to field research, but the cave dwellers' warning proved accurate. Over the past 2 years, my weather predictions have become increasingly unreliable, particularly when it comes to storm systems that develop over mountainous terrain. Equipment that worked perfectly for years now malfunctions at critical moments, and I find myself unable to explain atmospheric phenomena that should be routine to analyze. 3 months ago, I was tracking a storm system that was moving toward the Ozark region when it suddenly changed direction and intensity in ways that violated every principle of meteorology I had ever learned. The storm moved in a perfect circle around a specific mountain peak, maintaining Category 2 hurricane force winds for 6 hours before dissipating completely. That mountain peak was less than 10 miles from the cave where we had taken shelter. According to satellite data, the storm should have been impossible. According to my instruments, it should not have existed at all. But according to local residents who have lived in those mountains for generations, it was just another spring storm, no different from dozens of others they had witnessed over the years. I still work as a meteorologist, but I no longer trust the science that once seemed so reliable. Weather patterns in mountainous regions follow rules that are not written in any textbook, controlled by people who have learned to work with atmospheric forces in ways that make our most advanced technology look like children's toys. The Ozark Mountains have been home to human communities for thousands of years, long before weather satellites and computer models attempted to predict and control the forces of nature. Some of those communities never forgot the old ways of reading signs in the sky and calling storms when they were needed. They are still there, living in caves and underground passages, maintaining knowledge that modern science has dismissed as impossible. And sometimes when atmospheric conditions are right, and the mountain decides it needs new members, they send storms to guide the lost ones to their door. My name is Phoenix Anderson, and I have been a professional wilderness photographer for over a decade. My specialty is capturing the raw beauty of American forests during extreme weather conditions, particularly winter scenes when the landscape transforms into something almost otherworldly. The assignment that brought me to the Appalachian Trail in February of 2023 was supposed to be the culmination of my career. A month-long photography expedition documenting winter wildlife adaptation in the most remote sections of the trail system. I had planned the trip for 2 years, studying weather patterns, wildlife migration routes, and topographical features to identify the most promising locations for capturing unique images. My route would take me through sections of the trail in Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, focusing on high elevation areas where snow and ice create the most dramatic photographic opportunities. The expedition began in Shenandoah National Park on February 3rd, when temperatures were hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit and fresh snow had fallen for 3 consecutive days. Perfect conditions for the stark, minimalist compositions I was hoping to capture. I was carrying winter camping gear rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, plus over 40 pounds of camera equipment designed to function in extreme cold. For the first week, everything went according to plan. I captured images of frozen waterfalls, snow-laden branches creating natural sculptures, and wildlife tracks crisscrossing pristine white landscapes. The cold was brutal but manageable with proper clothing and shelter. I was averaging about 8 miles per day, stopping frequently to set up shots and waiting for optimal lighting conditions. It was during the second week, as I entered a particularly remote section of trail in West Virginia, that I began finding the unusual tracks. At first, I thought they were made by a large dog or possibly a wolf, though wolves had been extinct in this region for over a century. The prints were roughly canine in shape, but significantly larger than any domestic dog breed, with claw marks that extended unusually far from the toe pads. But as I studied the tracks more carefully, photographing them for documentation purposes, I realized they showed characteristics that did not match any known animal. The gait pattern was wrong for a quadruped, showing irregularities that suggested the creature sometimes walked on 2 legs rather than 4. The depth and distribution of weight suggested something much heavier than any dog or wolf, yet the tracks showed intelligence in their placement, deliberately avoiding areas where they would be easily spotted. I followed the tracks for over 2 miles, fascinated by the photographic opportunities they presented, and curious about what kind of animal could be creating such unusual prints. The trail led me off the main Appalachian Trail onto what appeared to be an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. The tracks became more numerous here, joined by others that suggested I was following not just one creature, but several. The logging road ended at what had once been a clear-cut area, now partially reforested with young trees and dense underbrush. In the center of this clearing was a structure that defied immediate explanation. It appeared to be some kind of shelter, but constructed using techniques I had never seen before. Large logs had been arranged in a complex pattern, partially buried in the earth, with spaces between them filled with smaller branches, leaves, and what looked like animal fur. But it was the size of the structure that truly shocked me. This was not a simple lean-to or hunting blind. It was easily 20 feet in diameter and appeared to extend underground, as if the visible portion was only the upper level of a much larger dwelling. Most disturbing of all was the smell emanating from inside, a mixture of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. I approached cautiously, camera ready, professional curiosity overcoming the growing sense of unease I was feeling. The entrance to the structure was partially hidden by hanging strips of bark and animal hide, but I could see that it opened into a much larger space than the exterior suggested. I took several photographs of the construction, noting the sophisticated engineering involved in creating such a stable shelter using only natural materials. That was when I heard the breathing, deep rhythmic exhalations coming from somewhere inside the structure, too loud and too slow to be coming from any normal-sized animal. I froze, camera still raised, trying to process what I was hearing. Whatever was inside that shelter was large, and it was awake. The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by sounds of movement, scraping and shuffling that suggested something large was rising to its feet. I backed away from the entrance, instinct screaming at me to run, but professional habit kept me focused on documenting what I was witnessing. What emerged from that winter den still haunts my nightmares. It was humanoid in basic shape, but changed by years of adaptation to extreme cold and harsh living conditions. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be a combination of matted hair and animal fur that had been deliberately attached to its skin. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, but distorted by malnutrition, frostbite damage, and primitive modifications, including filed teeth and scarification. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that terrified me most. This was not some mindless beast or person driven insane by isolation. This was a human being who had chosen to live like this, who had adapted to surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. It studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, taking in my modern winter gear, my expensive camera equipment, my obvious status as an outsider. Then it made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, clearly some form of communication directed not at me, but at others I could not see. The response was immediate. 3 more figures emerged from the den, each showing similar adaptations to extreme cold survival, but obviously part of the same family or clan group. They moved with coordinated precision, spreading out to surround my position with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. The largest of the group, the one who had emerged first, stepped forward and spoke to me in English that was heavily accented and difficult to understand, but unmistakably human language. "You take pictures," it said, gesturing toward my camera. "Show other people where we live." The statement was not a question but an accusation delivered with absolute certainty. I tried to explain that I was documenting wildlife and natural landscapes, that I had no intention of revealing their location or even mentioning their existence. But even as I spoke, I realized how hollow my words sounded. I was a professional photographer, and my entire career was built on sharing images of remote wilderness areas with the outside world. "Wintertime," the creature continued, "nobody comes to mountain. We sleep, save energy, wait for warm time. You bring other people, make us move again. Always moving, always hiding, never safe." That was when I understood what I was looking at. These were not people who had recently become lost or abandoned civilization. This was a family that had been living wild for generations, adapting to seasonal patterns that included winter hibernation-like behavior that allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill anyone unprepared for the extreme cold. The smaller figures were children, I realized, though their exact ages were impossible to determine due to their primitive lifestyle and adaptive modifications. They watched me with the same intelligent wariness as the adults, clearly understanding the threat that my presence represented to their survival. "Camera," the leader demanded, holding out a hand that was more claw than finger. "Give pictures." I had two choices: comply with their demands and lose weeks of work, or attempt to escape with my equipment and probably die in the process. These people had survived in conditions that challenged every limit of human endurance, and they knew this terrain better than any modern outdoorsman ever could. I handed over my camera memory cards, watching as the leader examined them briefly before passing them to one of the others, who disappeared back into the den. "We keep pictures," he said. "You go away. Never come back. Never tell people about Mountain Family." The message was delivered without obvious threat, but the implications were clear. They had dealt with unwanted discovery before, and they had methods for ensuring their continued secrecy. I was being allowed to leave because cooperation was preferable to the alternatives, but that cooperation was not negotiable. I left immediately, hiking back to the main trail in gathering darkness without stopping to set up camp. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees that night, and I barely survived despite having equipment rated for extreme cold. These people were living through conditions that nearly killed me even with modern winter survival gear. I completed my photography expedition but never developed or published any of the images that might have revealed the location of the winter den. The memory cards I had surrendered contained weeks of work, including some of the best winter wilderness photographs I had ever captured. But I never attempted to retrieve them or return to the area. 6 months later, I read a news report about search and rescue operations in the same area of West Virginia where I had encountered the hibernating family. 3 separate hiking parties had reported equipment theft and what they described as stalking behavior by unknown individuals. Local authorities concluded that the incidents were probably the work of drug manufacturers using remote locations for illegal operations. But I knew better. The Mountain Family was protecting their territory during the active season, using techniques that kept them hidden while discouraging others from exploring too deeply into their domain. They were not criminals or madmen, but survivors who had learned to live according to natural patterns that most people had forgotten centuries ago. I still work as a wilderness photographer, but I no longer seek out the most remote and extreme locations. I have learned that some places are meant to remain hidden, and some adaptations to harsh environments come at costs that civilized people cannot imagine. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, including people who chose to remain wild when others moved toward civilization. They are still there, following seasonal patterns that include winter dormancy periods that allow them to survive conditions that would kill most modern humans. They are patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to remaining hidden from a world that would either exploit them or try to save them from a life they have chosen. And they have learned that the best way to maintain their secrecy is to ensure that anyone who discovers them understands the importance of keeping that discovery private. My name is River Blackwood, and I have spent the last 17 years working as a forestry specialist for the United States Forest Service. My job involves surveying remote woodland areas, documenting biodiversity, and assessing the health of old-growth forest systems that have remained largely untouched by human development. It is work that has taken me into some of the most pristine and isolated wilderness areas in the southeastern United States, places where the trees have been growing undisturbed for centuries. In October of 2021, I was assigned to conduct a comprehensive survey of an old-growth section of Cherokee National Forest that had been designated for potential inclusion in a protected wilderness area. The site was located in a remote valley approximately 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, accessible only by hiking trails that had not been maintained for over a decade. The assignment was supposed to take 1 week, documenting tree species, measuring trunk diameters, and photographing unusual specimens for the official report. I had completed similar surveys dozens of times before, and this particular location had been recommended by my supervisor as one of the most spectacular examples of virgin forest remaining in North Carolina. What made this forest different from other old-growth areas I had surveyed was the sheer age and size of the trees. Some of the chestnut oaks and tulip poplars were clearly over 400 years old, with trunk diameters exceeding 6 feet. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight that felt ancient and primordial. But it was the silence that first made me uneasy. In 17 years of forest work, I had never experienced such complete absence of wildlife sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. The forest felt empty in a way that violated everything I knew about healthy ecosystem dynamics. On my second day in the area, I began finding the markings. At first, I thought they were natural scarring from lightning strikes or disease, but closer examination revealed deliberate patterns carved into the bark of specific trees. The marks were old, weathered by years of exposure, but clearly made by tools rather than natural processes. The markings appeared to be territorial markers of some kind, carved at precise intervals along what seemed to be established trails through the forest. Each marked tree displayed the same symbol, a spiral pattern that started small at the base and grew larger as it wound upward around the trunk. Following these trail markers led me deeper into the forest than my original survey area required. But scientific curiosity compelled me to document what appeared to be evidence of historical human habitation in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. The trail markers led to a clearing that should not have existed. According to topographical maps and aerial photography, this section of forest was continuous canopy with no natural openings. But there it was, a perfectly circular clearing about 200 feet in diameter, completely hidden from above by an interwoven canopy of branches that had been deliberately trained to grow together. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied every principle of forest conservation I had been trained to uphold. It was a dwelling built entirely from living trees, their trunks and branches shaped and guided over years to create walls, roof, and floor without killing the trees themselves. The structure was still alive, still growing, with leaves and new growth emerging from every surface. The craftsmanship was beyond anything I had ever seen. Whoever had created this living building possessed knowledge of tree biology and growth patterns that exceeded anything taught in modern forestry programs. They had convinced dozens of trees to grow in precise directions, their branches interweaving to create spaces that were both architecturally sound and biologically healthy. But the dwelling was not empty. As I approached to examine the construction more closely, I realized that people were living inside the treehouse. I could see movement through gaps in the living walls and smell wood smoke from a fire that must have been burning somewhere within the structure. I called out, identifying myself as a Forest Service employee and explaining that I was conducting a routine survey. The response was immediate and terrifying. The forest around me suddenly exploded with movement as figures emerged from camouflaged positions I had not even noticed. They had been watching me since I entered the clearing, possibly since I first found the trail markers. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothing made from forest materials and moving with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness. But what struck me most was their appearance. These were not primitive people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They were healthy, well-nourished, and clearly thriving in their forest environment. Their skin was darkened by sun and weather, their hair was long and adorned with feathers and plant materials. But their eyes showed intelligence and organization that suggested a sophisticated society. The apparent leader of the group was a woman who might have been 60 years old, with silver hair braided with vines and wearing a cloak made from what looked like living moss. She approached me without fear or aggression, studying me with the same scientific curiosity I was directing toward her and her people. "You are the tree counter," she said in perfect English, though her accent was unlike anything I had ever heard. "We have been watching your people measure our forest for 3 days now." I tried to explain that I was conducting a biodiversity survey, that my work was aimed at protecting the forest from development. She listened patiently, then gestured toward the living dwelling behind her. "We have been protecting this forest for 7 generations, she said. "Our ancestors learned to live with the trees instead of cutting them down, to build with growing wood instead of dead lumber. Your people want to protect the forest by keeping humans away from it. We protect it by becoming part of it." She explained that her community had been living in this valley since before the Cherokee Nation was forced to relocate, that they had chosen to remain hidden rather than join the removal to Oklahoma. Over the generations, they had developed techniques for forest living that left no trace on the ecosystem while providing everything they needed for a sustainable lifestyle. The living architecture was just one example of their innovations. They had learned to cultivate wild plants in ways that increased biodiversity rather than reducing it, to hunt and fish using methods that strengthened animal populations rather than depleting them, and to create tools and clothing from forest materials without damaging the sources. But they also made it clear that their survival depended on remaining hidden from the outside world. Government agencies, environmental groups, and commercial interests would all pose threats to their way of life if their existence became known. They had survived by ensuring that anyone who discovered their community understood the importance of keeping their secret. "Your survey will recommend that this area be protected," the woman continued. "That is good. But your report will not mention us, and you will not return here again. We have ways of making sure the forest keeps its secrets, and we have used those ways before when necessary." The threat was delivered without hostility, but with absolute certainty. These people had remained hidden for over a century, and had clearly developed methods for dealing with unwanted discovery. I had no doubt that they possessed both the knowledge and the will to eliminate any threat to their security. I spent the rest of that day being shown through their community, observing construction techniques and forest management practices that revolutionized my understanding of sustainable living. They had created a civilization that existed in perfect harmony with the natural environment, taking only what they needed and giving back more than they consumed. Their knowledge of plant biology, animal behavior, and ecological relationships exceeded anything I had learned in graduate school or 17 years of professional experience. They knew things about forest ecosystems that modern science had not yet discovered, and they had used that knowledge to create a way of life that was both primitive and incredibly sophisticated. But they also made it clear that this knowledge would not be shared with the outside world. Their survival depended on remaining hidden, and they had learned through bitter experience that contact with modern civilization meant destruction of their way of life. I left the next morning with a complete understanding of why this forest had seemed so empty of wildlife. The animals were there, but they had learned to hide from human observers. The forest dwellers had trained them to avoid contact with outsiders, creating an illusion of emptiness that helped protect the community's secret. My official report recommended the area for wilderness protection based on the exceptional size and age of the old-growth trees. I made no mention of the human community or their remarkable innovations in sustainable forest living. As far as the Forest Service is concerned, the valley contains nothing but trees. But sometimes when I am conducting surveys in other remote forest areas, I find myself looking for signs of similar communities. I study unusual tree growth patterns and wonder if they might be evidence of living architecture. I listen for the absence of wildlife sounds that might indicate human habitation designed to remain hidden. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres of wilderness, much of it never fully explored or documented. There is room in that vast expanse for communities that have learned to live without leaving traces. People who have chosen to remain part of the natural world rather than trying to dominate it. They are still there, protecting the forest by becoming one with it, maintaining knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of sustainable living. But that knowledge will remain hidden as long as the outside world continues to view wilderness as something to be either exploited or preserved, rather than something to live with as equals.